This video will help you sleep and relax. But before we begin, I would like to know which city you're from and what time you're watching this. Now, subscribe to the channel, relax, and let's begin. As we settled into our seats, I noticed a man sitting alone at the far end of the car. He was wearing a rumpled, outdated suit that looked like it had seen better days. His hair was disheveled, and he seemed to be mumbling to himself, rocking back and forth slightly. I nudged Lucia and whispered, "Check out that weird guy over there." She glanced over and I saw her eyes widen. "Oh man, he gives me the creeps," she whispered back. "Let's move to another car." But before we could get up, the train lurched forward and we were on our way. I tried to focus on my phone, but I couldn't help stealing glances at the strange man. There was something off about him that I couldn't quite put my finger on. As we rattled through the dark tunnels, I noticed the man kept reaching back to scratch at his neck. At first, I thought he just had an itch, but he was doing it almost constantly. When he turned his head slightly, I caught a glimpse of something on the back of his neck that made my blood run cold. It looked like he had scales, grayish-green reptilian scales covering the nape of his neck and disappearing down the collar of his shirt. I blinked hard, certain I must be seeing things, but when I looked again, they were still there. "Lucia," I hissed urgently, "do you see that? On his neck?" She leaned forward, squinting to get a better look, her face drained of color. "What the hell?" she breathed. The man's mumbling grew louder. I strained to make out what he was saying, but it sounded like gibberish. Occasionally I caught what sounded like words in Spanish, but they didn't make any sense strung together. A chill ran down my spine. Every instinct was screaming at me that we were in danger. I gripped Lucia's arm tightly, my palms sweaty with fear. "We need to get off this train," I whispered. She nodded frantically. "Next stop, we'll run for it." The minutes crawled by agonizingly slowly. I kept my eyes locked on the man, terrified he would suddenly turn and look at us. But he remained facing forward, scratching incessantly at his scaly neck. Finally, we pulled into the next station, Lagunilla. As the doors slid open, the man stood up. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might burst out of my chest. But instead of turning towards us, he began shuffling backwards towards the door. His movements were jerky and unnatural, like a marionette being pulled by invisible strings. He kept his back to us the entire time as he exited the train. As soon as he was gone, Lucia and I bolted out of our seats and off the train. We ran up the stairs to street level, gasping for breath. The cool night air hit my face and I gulped it down gratefully. "What the fuck was that?" Lucia panted, her eyes wild with fear. I shook my head, unable to form words. My mind was reeling, trying to make sense of what we'd just witnessed. Nothing about it seemed real or possible. We were so shaken that we didn't even think about how we'd get home from this unfamiliar station. As we stood there trying to collect ourselves, an older woman approached us. "Are you girls all right?" she asked, concern etched on her weathered face. "You look like you've seen a ghost." We must have looked a mess, pale, sweaty, and trembling. I managed to stammer out that we'd had a scary encounter on the train and weren't sure how to get home from here. The woman introduced herself as Señora Martinez and said she lived in our neighborhood. She kindly offered to accompany us home, saying it wasn't safe for young women to be out alone so late. As we walked, Lucia and I tried to explain what had happened, but the more we talked about it, the crazier it sounded. Scales? A man walking backwards? We must have imagined it, right? But Señora Martinez listened patiently without judgment. "There are many strange things in this world that can't be explained," she said sagely. "The important thing is that you're safe now." When we finally reached my apartment building, I felt a wave of relief wash over me. Senora Martinez made sure we got inside safely before continuing on her way. Lucia decided to stay over. Neither of us wanted to be alone after what happened. We stayed up late into the night, replaying the bizarre encounter over and over, but we couldn't make any more sense of it. In the days and weeks that followed, I found myself obsessively researching strange phenomena on the Mexico City metro. But I never found anything that came close to explaining what we saw that night. Sometimes I wonder if it was all just a shared hallucination brought on by stress and sleep deprivation. But then I'll catch a glimpse of something out of the corner of my eye, a flash of scales, an unnatural movement, and that paralyzing fear comes rushing back. I still take the metro regularly. I have to. It's the most efficient way to get around the city. But I'm always on high alert now, scanning each car for anything out of the ordinary. And I never, ever ride late at night if I can help it. Lucia and I don't talk about that night much anymore. It's like an unspoken agreement between us to try and forget it ever happened. But I know neither of us ever will. Some experiences change you forever, leaving you with more questions than answers. I often find myself wondering about that strange man. Who was he? What was wrong with him? Was he even human? And most chillingly, is he still out there somewhere in the sprawling Mexico City metro system, waiting to terrify some other unsuspecting passengers? I may never know the truth about what really happened that night, but one thing's for certain. I'll never look at a late-night train ride the same way again. The memory of those otherworldly scales and that eerie backwards walk will haunt me for the rest of my days. Sometimes I think I catch a whiff of that same stale smell from the train car, or hear echoes of that nonsensical muttering. In those moments, my heart races, and I'm transported right back to that terrifying night. I've become hyper-aware of the strangers around me on public transportation. Every odd mannerism or unusual appearance sets me on edge. Is that person just eccentric or something more sinister? Lucia and I have grown apart somewhat since that night. I think being around each other serves as too strong a reminder of what we experienced. We never openly discuss it, but I can see the same haunted look in her eyes that I know is in mine. I've tried talking to a therapist about it, but I always stop short of revealing the full story. How can I explain something I don't understand myself? How can I make someone else believe in something so utterly bizarre and implausible? So I carry this secret with me, letting it gnaw away at me from the inside. Some nights I lie awake, replaying every detail in my mind, searching for some explanation I might have missed. But I always come up empty. All I know is that there are things in this world beyond our understanding, forces or creatures or phenomena that defy explanation. And once you've had a brush with them, you can never go back to blissful ignorance. I'm more cautious now, more wary of the shadows. I find myself studying the people around me, looking for any sign of something inhuman lurking beneath the surface. Is the Metro B line cursed? Haunted? A portal to some other dimension? Or was it simply a case of being in the wrong place at the wrong time, crossing paths with something never meant for human eyes? I may never know the answers, but I'll never forget that night or the chilling realization that the world is far stranger and more dangerous than we could ever imagine. And who knows, maybe someday I'll encounter that scaled man again and finally unravel the mystery that has consumed my thoughts for so long. Until then, I'll keep riding the metro, eyes wide open, always on guard, because now I know that in the tunnels beneath Mexico City, anything is possible, and not all of it is benign. I was on my way home from another exhausting shift at the hospital. It was late, around 11 p.m., and the subway car was nearly empty. Just me and a couple other stragglers spread out, all of us wearing masks and keeping our distance. I'd been working 12-hour days for weeks on end as COVID cases surged, and I was running on fumes. As I zoned out, staring blankly at my reflection in the scratched plexiglass divider, I barely registered the train stopping at the next station. The doors slid open with a hiss. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw someone step into the car. Something made me look up. Maybe it was the way they moved or some subconscious recognition. But when I turned my head, I felt like I'd been punched in the gut. It was me. An exact copy of myself, down to the blue scrubs and worn sneakers, had just boarded the train. For a moment, I wondered if I'd fallen asleep and was dreaming. I blinked hard, but when I opened my eyes, my doppelganger was still there. He, or I guess I should say I, took a seat across from me, maintaining eye contact the whole time. We stared at each other in silence. I felt frozen, unable to speak or move. It was like looking in a mirror, except the reflection was alive and breathing. As I studied him more closely, I noticed subtle differences. His hair was a bit grayer at the temples. There were a few more lines around his eyes. He looked like me, but older, maybe by 5 years or so. Finally, I managed to croak out, "Who are you?" My duplicate tilted his head, considering me. When he spoke, it was my voice, but rougher, more tired. "You know who I am. I'm you. Just a little further down the line." A chill ran through me. "That's impossible," I said, even as my eyes told me otherwise. "How can you be here?" He shrugged. "I'm not entirely sure myself, but I had to come back to warn you." "Warn me about what?" I asked, my heart pounding. "About what's coming," he replied grimly. "The pandemic. It's going to get so much worse before it gets better. You need to be prepared." I shook my head, trying to make sense of this surreal situation. "But how? How are you here? Time travel isn't real." "Isn't it?" he countered. "We're doctors. We've seen things that defy explanation. Is this really so far-fetched in comparison?" He had a point. In my years of medical practice, I'd witnessed recoveries that bordered on miraculous. But this was on another level entirely. "Okay," I said slowly. "Let's say I believe you. What exactly are you here to warn me about?" My older self leaned forward, his eyes intense behind his mask. "The next few months are going to be hell. The hospital will be overwhelmed. You'll lose patients, colleagues, friends. It's going to push you to your breaking point." I felt a wave of dread wash over me. "But we'll get through it, right? Things will improve?" He nodded. "Eventually, yes. But the toll it takes, it changes you, changes us. I came back to help you, to help us weather the storm." "How?" I asked desperately. "What can I do?" "First, you need to start stockpiling supplies now. PPE, medications, everything you can get your hands on. It won't be enough, but it'll help." I nodded, making mental notes. "Second," he continued, "you need to take care of yourself. I know it goes against every instinct, but you have to rest when you can. Eat properly. Stay connected with loved ones, even if it's just virtually. If you burn out, you can't help anyone." "Okay," I agreed. "What else?" He hesitated, then said, "There's going to be a night about 2 months from now. You'll lose 3 patients in a single shift. Young people who should have survived. It will nearly break you." I felt my chest tighten at the thought. "What do I do?" Remember why you became a doctor in the first place, he said softly. Hold on to that, and know that for every life lost, there are others you'll save. Focus on the lives you can change. I nodded, fighting back tears. Is that why you came back? To tell me this? He shook his head. Not just that. There's something else, something critical. But before he could continue, the train lurched to a stop. The overhead speaker crackled to life, announcing my station. This is my stop, I said, panicked. I have to go. What were you going to tell me? My doppelganger stood as well. I'll walk with you. We don't have much time. As we exited the train, I noticed the platform was eerily empty. Our footsteps echoed in the cavernous space as we walked. Listen carefully, my older self said urgently. In about 6 months, there will be a breakthrough, a treatment protocol that significantly reduces mortality rates. But it won't be widely adopted at first due to skepticism and bureaucratic red tape. What's the treatment? I asked. I can't give you specifics. It could alter the timeline too much. But when you hear about a new combination therapy involving an antiviral and an immunomodulator, fight for it. Push the hospital administration to implement it. It will save lives. We reached the stairs leading up to the street. I turned to face my double, 1,000 questions swirling in my mind. How will I know it's the right treatment? What if I make the wrong choice? He put a hand on my shoulder. The touch felt real, solid. Trust your instincts. You're a good doctor. Deep down, you'll know. I nodded, overwhelmed by the weight of this knowledge. Thank you, I said, for coming back, for warning me. He smiled sadly. Thank yourself. We're the same person after all. As I turned to climb the stairs, a thought struck me. I spun back around. Wait, will I see you again? How will I know if I've changed things? But the platform was empty. My doppelganger had vanished as suddenly as he had appeared. I stood there for a long moment, half convinced I had imagined the whole thing. But the memory was too vivid, the details too specific. Whatever had just happened, it was real. As I climbed the stairs and emerged onto the quiet, empty street, my mind raced. Part of me wanted to dismiss the encounter as a stress-induced hallucination, but a larger part knew I couldn't ignore what had happened. The stakes were too high. I walked home in a daze, my older self's warnings echoing in my head. The weight of responsibility settled heavily on my shoulders. I had been given a glimpse of a possible future, a brutal, harrowing future, and the chance to potentially change it. As I reached my apartment building, I made a decision. Whether this had been a vivid dream, a mental breakdown, or an actual brush with time travel, I would heed the warnings. I would prepare as best I could for the challenges ahead. And when the time came, I would fight for that treatment, trusting that it could make a difference. I unlocked my door and stepped inside, feeling both exhausted and oddly energized. As I washed up and got ready for bed, I couldn't shake the image of my older self, the weariness in his eyes, the urgency in his voice. Lying in bed, staring at the ceiling, I replayed our conversation over and over. There were so many unanswered questions. How had he traveled back in time? Why choose that specific moment to appear? And what would happen now? Had I already changed the future simply by having this knowledge? I tossed and turned for hours, my mind unable to quiet. When I finally drifted off near dawn, my dreams were a confused jumble of masked figures, crowded hospital corridors, and my own face staring back at me from impossible places. The next morning I woke up feeling like I hadn't slept at all. For a moment, as consciousness slowly returned, I wondered if the whole subway encounter had been an elaborate dream. But as I got up and went about my morning routine, the memories remained crystal clear. As I got dressed for another long shift at the hospital, I made a mental list of supplies to start stockpiling. I also resolved to be more diligent about self-care, heeding my future self's warnings about burnout. Walking to the subway station, I felt a mix of emotions: fear about what was to come, determination to face it head-on, and a lingering sense of unreality about the whole situation. As I descended the stairs to the platform, I couldn't help glancing around, half expecting to see my doppelganger again. But the station was filled with the usual morning commuters, all masked and keeping their distance. No time-traveling duplicates in sight. As I boarded the train, I realized that whether or not I ever saw my older self again, his visit had irrevocably changed me. I had been given a gift, foreknowledge, and a chance to make a difference. I silently vowed not to waste it. The train pulled away from the station, carrying me toward another day of battling the pandemic. But now, armed with warnings from the future, I felt more prepared for whatever challenges lay ahead. The memory of my encounter on that surreal night would stay with me, driving me forward through the darkest days to come. I was on my way home from university, taking the Metro Line 3 as usual. It had been a long day of classes, and I was looking forward to relaxing at home. The train was fairly empty as I boarded at Miguel Ángel de Quevedo station, heading towards Copilco. I found a seat and settled in for the short ride, absent-mindedly scrolling through my phone. A few stops later, I glanced up and noticed an elderly woman had gotten on the train. She was standing near the doors with her back to me, wearing a long, dark coat despite the warm weather. Something about her seemed off, but I couldn't quite put my finger on what it was. I tried to shake the uneasy feeling and return my attention to my phone, but I found my eyes kept being drawn back to the woman. Her posture was unnaturally stiff and still. Most people sway slightly with the motion of the train, but she remained perfectly motionless. A chill ran down my spine. I told myself I was being silly. She was just an ordinary passenger. Still, I couldn't help but feel relieved when we reached Copilco station and I could exit the train. As I climbed the stairs out of the station, I took a deep breath of the fresh evening air, trying to calm my nerves. The streets were busy with people heading home from work or out to dinner. I started walking towards my apartment, looking forward to being home. I had only gone a block when I noticed a familiar dark coat out of the corner of my eye. My heart started racing as I realized it was the same woman from the train. How had she gotten ahead of me so quickly, and why was she going the same direction? I picked up my pace, weaving through the crowd on the sidewalk. But when I glanced back, the woman was still there, moving unnaturally fast to keep up. Panic started to set in. I ducked into a small tienda, pretending to browse the shelves while keeping an eye on the street outside. After a few minutes, I didn't see her. I breathed a sigh of relief, thinking I had lost her. I cautiously exited the store and continued towards home at a brisk walk. The sun was setting and long shadows stretched across the street. I was only a few blocks from my apartment when I saw her again. She was standing perfectly still on the corner ahead, her back to me once more. My blood ran cold. This couldn't be happening. I froze, unsure what to do. Should I turn and run, try to confront her? As I stood there paralyzed with fear, she slowly began to turn around. Time seemed to slow down as her face came into view, but it wasn't a human face at all. Where there should have been eyes, nose, and mouth, there was a dog's muzzle, jet black and twisted into a snarl. I let out a scream of terror that died in my throat as those inhuman eyes locked onto mine. In that moment, my survival instincts finally kicked in. I turned and ran faster than I ever had in my life. I didn't dare look back, terrified of what I might see. My lungs were burning and my legs ached, but I didn't slow down until I reached my apartment building. I fumbled with my keys, hands shaking so badly I could barely get the door open. Once inside, I slammed it shut and engaged every lock. I ran to my bedroom and hid under the covers like a child, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst. Sleep was impossible that night. Every creak and shadow had me on edge, convinced the dog-faced woman was coming for me. When morning finally came, I was exhausted but too afraid to leave my apartment. I called in sick to school and spent the day researching online, desperate for some explanation of what I had seen. I found a few vague references to folklore about shapeshifters and dog-headed beings, but nothing that matched my experience exactly. Had it all been a hallucination brought on by stress and lack of sleep? But it had felt so real, so viscerally terrifying. Days passed, and I remained jumpy and paranoid. I avoided taking the metro, instead spending a fortune on Uber rides. I varied my routes home and constantly looked over my shoulder. My friends noticed something was wrong, but I was too embarrassed and afraid to tell them what had happened. They would think I was crazy. Gradually, life started to return to some semblance of normalcy, but I never forgot that night. To this day, years later, I still get a chill down my spine when I see an elderly woman in a long coat. I've never encountered the dog-faced being again, but the fear that I might remains. I don't know what I saw that night near Copilco Station. Was it a supernatural entity, a bizarre costume or mask, or just the product of an overtired mind? I'll probably never know for certain, but I do know that I'll never feel truly safe on the metro again. Sometimes I wonder if others have had similar experiences. Are there other people out there who have encountered inexplicable, terrifying things on public transit? Or am I alone in this? I've thought about posting my story online to see if anyone else relates, but I'm afraid of being mocked or dismissed. So I keep it to myself, this strange and horrifying memory. But on dark nights when I'm alone, I still sometimes imagine I hear the click of claws on pavement outside my window. And I wonder if someday, somehow, I'll come face to face with that nightmarish visage once again. The experience changed me in ways I'm still discovering. I've become more cautious, more aware of my surroundings. I find myself studying the faces of strangers, looking for any hint of something inhuman lurking behind their eyes. It's exhausting to live with this constant vigilance, but I can't seem to let my guard down. I've tried therapy, but it's hard to open up about something so bizarre and unbelievable. How do you explain to a mental health professional that you're traumatized by an encounter with a dog-faced woman on the metro? They'd probably think I was delusional or on drugs, so I cope as best I can on my own. I've taken up meditation and yoga, trying to calm my frayed nerves. I keep a journal where I write about my feelings and experiences. Sometimes just getting the words out on paper helps make it all feel more manageable. But there are still nights when I wake up in a cold sweat, the image of that snarling black muzzle vivid in my mind. On those nights, sleep is impossible. I lie awake until dawn, every sound making me flinch. I've become somewhat of an amateur researcher into the paranormal and unexplained. I've read countless books and articles, watched documentaries, even attended a few conferences. I'm always hoping to find some tidbit of information that might explain what I saw, but so far nothing quite fits. My relationships have suffered too. It's hard to connect with people when you're carrying around such a huge secret. I find myself pulling away from friends and family, afraid that if I let them get too close, they'll somehow sense the strangeness in me. Dating is especially difficult. How do you build intimacy and trust with someone when you can't even tell them about one of the most significant experiences of your life? I've had a few short-lived relationships, but they always fizzle out when the other person realizes I'm holding something back. Sometimes I wonder if I'll ever be able to move past this. Will I spend the rest of my life looking over my shoulder, jumping at shadows? Or will I someday find a way to integrate this experience into my life in a healthy way? For now, all I can do is take it one day at a time. I go to work. I see friends when I can muster the energy. I try to find joy in small things. But always, in the back of my mind is the memory of that night on the metro. The night I came face to face with something that shouldn't exist, something that shattered my understanding of reality. I don't know if I'll ever have answers, but I do know that I'll never forget the terror of that moment when the woman turned and I saw the face of a dog where a human face should have been. It's a memory that will haunt me for the rest of my days. So if you're reading this and you've had a similar experience, know that you're not alone. And if you haven't, count yourself lucky. Because once you've seen behind the veil of reality, there's no going back. The world becomes a stranger, more dangerous place. A place where dog-faced women can appear on the metro and vanish into the night, leaving nothing but fear and questions in their wake. I was running late for work that morning, so I rushed to catch the 8:15 train like I always do. Everything seemed normal at first. The same sleepy commuters, the familiar rumble of the tracks. I found an empty seat and settled in for the 30-minute ride downtown. About 10 minutes in, I noticed the lights in the car start to flicker slightly. I didn't think much of it at first, figuring it was just a minor electrical issue. But then things started to get weird. The flickering intensified, almost like a strobe effect. I blinked hard, trying to clear my vision. When I opened my eyes again, I was stunned to see we were pulling into a completely different station than the one we should have been approaching. The signs on the platform said Oakwood Station, but that was impossible. Oakwood was in the opposite direction, at least 5 stops past my destination. I looked around in confusion, but no one else seemed alarmed. The other passengers just stared blankly ahead or at their phones. A chill ran down my spine as I noticed their faces looked off somehow, washed out and sepia-toned like an old photograph. I rubbed my eyes, certain I must be seeing things. But when I looked again, the bizarre sepia effect remained. Even stranger, the people's movements seemed slightly jerky and unnatural, like an old film reel. My heart was pounding now. I grabbed my phone to check the time, but the screen was black and unresponsive. Looking out the window, I saw we were moving again, speeding through unfamiliar tunnels. "Excuse me," I said to the woman next to me, my voice shaky. "Do you know where we are? This isn't the right route." She slowly turned her head to look at me, but her eyes were blank and unfocused. Her mouth moved, but no sound came out. Horrified, I stumbled to my feet and moved away. The train screeched to a halt at another unknown station. Through the windows, I could see the platform was completely deserted. The station name was blurred and unreadable. "Hello? Can anyone tell me what's going on?" I called out desperately, but the other passengers remained motionless, like eerie mannequins. Panicking now, I ran to the doors, intending to get off at the next stop, wherever it was. But they wouldn't budge. I pounded on them frantically as the train started moving again. We plunged into darkness. The lights in the car went out completely, leaving only a faint glow from the emergency strips along the floor. I fumbled my way back to a seat, my breath coming in ragged gasps. After what felt like an eternity, dim lights flickered back on. I blinked in the sudden brightness. To my shock, the car was now packed with people. Dozens of blank-faced strangers pressed in around me, their skin an unnatural grayish hue. I squeezed my eyes shut, willing this nightmare to end. When I opened them, the car was empty again, except for a few normal-looking passengers. Sweat was pouring down my face. What the hell was happening to me? The lights continued to flicker erratically as we sped through the tunnels. At times, ghostly after-images seemed to linger in the air. Shadowy figures flickered at the edges of my vision. I lost all sense of time and direction. We would emerge briefly at unfamiliar stations, only to plunge back into darkness. Sometimes the car seemed to stretch impossibly long. Other times it felt claustrophobically small. My head was spinning. I squeezed my eyes shut and focused on taking deep breaths, desperately trying to stay calm. This couldn't be real. I had to be dreaming or hallucinating. When I opened my eyes again, we were finally pulling into my home station. I've never felt such overwhelming relief. As soon as the doors opened, I bolted out onto the platform. My legs were shaking so badly I could barely walk. I staggered up the stairs and out onto the street, gulping in the fresh air. Everything looked normal again. People hurried past on their morning commutes. Cars honked in traffic. I glanced at my watch, praying I hadn't missed my entire workday in whatever timeless void I'd been trapped in. My blood ran cold when I saw the time, 10:17 a.m. That was impossible. I'd left my apartment at 8 a.m. Even accounting for delays, the trip should have taken 45 minutes at most. Where had those lost hours gone? In a daze, I made my way to the office. My coworkers gave me strange looks as I stumbled in. "There you are," my boss exclaimed. "We were getting worried. Why didn't you answer your phone?" I mumbled some excuse about oversleeping and train delays. How could I possibly explain what had really happened? I could barely understand it myself. The rest of the day passed in a blur. I couldn't focus on anything. My mind kept replaying flashes of that surreal train ride, the flickering lights, the bizarrely distorted passengers, the impossible shifts in time and space. Had it all been some kind of vivid hallucination, a waking nightmare brought on by stress and lack of sleep? But it had felt so viscerally real. And those missing hours. I left work early, unable to shake my growing sense of unease. On the bus ride home, I kept glancing nervously at my fellow passengers, half expecting to see sepia-toned faces and jerky movements. But everything seemed perfectly normal. Back in my apartment, I paced restlessly, unable to settle. I tried calling my mom, needing to hear a familiar voice, but the call wouldn't go through. The same with my best friend and my sister. Frustrated, I checked my phone's signal, full bars. With shaking hands, I pulled up a local news site, scanning for any reports of subway malfunctions or unexplained phenomena. Nothing. I don't know what compelled me to do it, but I found myself digging through a drawer for an old subway map. My eyes widened as I traced the familiar routes. The Oakwood station I'd seen didn't exist. Neither did any of the other mysterious stops we'd passed through. A chill ran through me. What the hell had happened to me this morning? Where had I really been during those lost hours? The rest of the evening passed in a haze of confusion and mounting dread. I barely slept, jolting awake from vivid nightmares of endless tunnels and faceless crowds. The next morning, I seriously debated calling in sick. The thought of getting back on the subway filled me with terror, but I couldn't afford to miss work, and I told myself I was being irrational. It was just a one-time weird experience, probably brought on by stress or some kind of mini blackout. Still, my hands were shaking as I swiped my Metro card. I held my breath as I boarded the train, half expecting flickering lights and sepia-toned faces. But the ride was completely ordinary. I started to relax, laughing at myself for getting so worked up. Clearly, I just had some kind of strange episode yesterday. Maybe I really had fallen asleep on the train and dreamed the whole thing. But then I noticed something that made my blood run cold. Tucked into the seat across from me was a crumpled newspaper. The masthead read the Oakwood Times. I snatched it up with trembling hands. The date at the top said June 15th, 1952. My head spinning, I flipped through the yellowed pages. The articles were about places and people I'd never heard of. Ads for products that hadn't existed in decades. I looked up wildly, sure I must be hallucinating again. But the other passengers were absorbed in their phones or books, paying me no attention. Feeling like I might be sick, I shoved the paper into my bag. I spent the rest of the ride gripping the seat, my heart pounding. At work, I hid in a bathroom stall and examined the paper again with shaking hands. It was real, brittle and musty smelling with age. I Googled frantically on my phone, searching for any mention of Oakwood or the newspaper. Nothing. It was like they had never existed. That night I barely slept. I kept the paper hidden under my mattress, terrified of what its existence might mean. Had I somehow slipped through time yesterday, traveled to some parallel world? The next few weeks passed in a fog of confusion and mounting paranoia. I started noticing other little oddities, store names that seemed to change overnight, streets that didn't quite match my memory. Was I losing my mind, or had that day on the subway somehow fractured my reality? I'm still struggling to make sense of it all. Some days I manage to convince myself it was all just a vivid hallucination. But then I'll catch a glimpse of that newspaper, yellowed and impossible, and the terror comes rushing back. I don't know if I'll ever understand what really happened to me that day. All I know is that my perception of reality has been permanently shaken. Every time I step onto the subway now, a part of me wonders, will this be the day it happens again? Will I find myself lost once more in that nightmare of shifting time and space? The not knowing is the worst part. I go about my days as normally as I can, but there's always that undercurrent of dread, that feeling that at any moment the world around me might twist and distort into something unrecognizable. I've thought about seeing a therapist, but I'm afraid they'll just think I'm crazy. And honestly, I'm not sure I want answers. What if the truth is even more terrifying than not knowing? So I just try to keep going day by day. But I'll never forget that surreal train ride, or the lingering sense that reality is far more fragile than we realize. Who knows what strange worlds might be lurking just beyond the veil of our perception, waiting to break through. As I walked down into the station, I noticed it was eerily quiet. Usually there were at least a few other commuters around, even at this hour, but tonight I seemed to be the only one there. The fluorescent lights flickered slightly, casting strange shadows. I shrugged it off, figuring it was just my exhaustion making everything seem a bit off. I swiped my Metro card and made my way to the platform. A train arrived within a few minutes, and I got on, grateful to sit down after being on my feet all day. As we pulled into the Auditorio station, I gathered my things and stepped off onto the platform. That's when things started to get weird. The platform looked different somehow. The tiles seemed older and more worn than I remembered. The ads on the walls were for products I'd never heard of, with a distinctly retro vibe. Even the air felt different, mustier, with a faint smell of cigarette smoke that definitely shouldn't have been there in a modern subway station. I blinked hard, wondering if I was hallucinating from fatigue. But when I opened my eyes again, everything still looked off. My heart started to race as I climbed the stairs to the upper level, hoping things would look normal once I got above ground. Instead, it only got stranger. The turnstiles were gone, replaced by an old-fashioned ticket booth. The walls were bare concrete, with exposed wiring and pipes. Scaffolding and construction equipment were scattered around. It looked like the station was still being built. My breath caught in my throat as I noticed a man in a hard hat and reflective vest standing near one of the walls. He was staring at me with a look of utter shock and confusion. "Hey!" I called out, my voice shaking. "What's going on here? Why does everything look like this?" The man's eyes went wide. He took a step back, lifting his hands as if to ward me off. "Who are you? How did you get in here?" he demanded. "This area is closed to the public. The station won't be open for months." I felt like I was going to pass out. This couldn't be happening. Had I somehow stepped back in time? Was I dreaming? I just got off the train," I stammered. "What do you mean it won't be open for months? I ride through here every day." The man's face went pale. He fumbled for a walkie-talkie on his belt. "I need security up here now," he said urgently into the device. "We've got an intruder. I don't know how she got in." Panic seized me. I turned and ran back down the stairs to the platform, my heart pounding. This had to be some kind of mistake or prank. Maybe I'd wandered onto a movie set somehow, but deep down, I knew that explanation didn't make sense. As I reached the bottom of the stairs, I skidded to a halt in shock. The platform looked normal again. Modern tiles, current ads on the walls, no hint of construction. A few other late-night commuters stood waiting for the next train, giving me odd looks as I stood there gasping for breath. I heard footsteps pounding down the stairs behind me and whirled around, expecting to see the construction worker in pursuit. But it was just my cousin Melissa, looking concerned. "Diana, are you okay?" she asked, putting a hand on my shoulder. "You look like you've seen a ghost." I stared at her, then back at the now normal platform. I don't know what just happened," I said shakily. "Everything looked different a minute ago, like it was decades in the past. There was a construction worker." Melissa frowned. "What are you talking about? I just got here and saw you run down the stairs like something was chasing you. The station looks totally normal to me." I shook my head, trying to clear it. "Let's go back upstairs," I said. "I need to see." We climbed the stairs together. Everything on the upper level looked exactly as it always did. Modern turnstiles, digital signs, vending machines. No sign of construction or anything out of place. "See? It's fine," Melissa said gently. "You must have dozed off for a second and had a weird dream or something. You said you just got off a long shift, right? You're probably exhausted." I nodded slowly, but I knew it hadn't been a dream. It had felt far too real, too visceral. The musty smell, the look of fear in that worker's eyes. Those weren't things my brain could have conjured up so vividly. "Maybe you're right," I said, not wanting to argue. "Let's just go get some food. I definitely need to eat and clear my head." As we left the station, I couldn't shake the feeling that something truly strange had just occurred. Had I briefly slipped through some kind of temporal portal, glimpsed an echo of the past, or was I really just overtired and imagining things? Over dinner, I told Melissa the full story of what I'd experienced. To her credit, She listened without judgment, even though I could tell she was skeptical. "Look, I know how it sounds," I said, "but I swear to you it felt completely real. I interacted with that worker. He saw me too. He was just as freaked out as I was. How could I have imagined all that?" Melissa shrugged. "The human mind is capable of some pretty wild things when it's exhausted. Maybe you saw some old pictures of the station under construction recently, and your brain incorporated that into a vivid hallucination?" I shook my head. "I've never seen pictures like that. And anyway, that doesn't explain the smell or the feeling of the air changing. It was like I was physically transported to another time." "Okay, let's say for argument's sake that it really happened," Melissa said. "What do you think it means? Why would you randomly time travel for just a few minutes?" I sighed. "I have no idea. Maybe there's some kind of, I don't know, weak spot in reality in that station, a place where the walls between past and present are thinner. It sounds crazy, but so is what happened to me." We speculated for a while longer, but ultimately had no answers. As we were leaving the diner, Melissa suggested we go back to the station to see if anything strange happened again. Part of me was reluctant. What if I really did travel through time again? But my curiosity won out. We headed back to Auditorio Station around 2 a.m. The station was deserted this time. We wandered around both levels for almost an hour, but everything remained stubbornly normal. No flickering lights, no strange smells, no glimpses into the past. "Maybe it was a one-time thing," Melissa said as we finally gave up and left. "A random blip in the fabric of space-time or whatever." I nodded, feeling both relieved and oddly disappointed. "Yeah, I guess so. Still doesn't explain what actually happened, though." In the weeks that followed, I found myself unable to stop thinking about that night. I scoured the internet for any stories of similar experiences at that station or any historical information about its construction, but found nothing unusual. I even tried going back to the station at the same time on several occasions, hoping to trigger whatever had happened before. But each time, everything remained frustratingly normal. Eventually, I had to accept that I might never know the truth about what I experienced that night. Was it really a brief journey to the past? A vivid hallucination? Some kind of shared mass delusion between me and that worker? There's no way to be sure. But I know what I saw, heard, and felt. For those few minutes, I truly believe I stood in a different time. The memory of it is as clear as anything else I've experienced. Sometimes when I'm in that station now, I find myself holding my breath as I climb those stairs, half expecting and half hoping to emerge once again into that strange in-between place, a station caught between past and present. So far, it hasn't happened again. But I can't shake the feeling that somewhere in the depths of Auditorio Station, a doorway to another time is waiting to open once more. I was so excited for my solo trip to Costa Rica. After months of planning and saving up, I finally landed in San Jose, ready for the adventure of a lifetime. The first few days were amazing. I explored the bustling capital city, hiked through lush rainforests, and relaxed on pristine beaches. I felt exhilarated and free, thinking this trip was exactly what I needed to recharge and gain some perspective. On my 5th day, I decided to treat myself to dinner at a highly rated local restaurant in Puerto Viejo, a small beach town on the Caribbean coast. As I sat at the bar enjoying my cocktail and waiting for my food, I noticed an older man, probably in his mid-50s, kept glancing in my direction. At first I brushed it off, figuring he was just people watching like many solo diners do. But as the night went on, his stares became more frequent and intense. I started to feel uncomfortable, especially when I realized he seemed to be timing his trips to the restroom with mine. Every time I got up, he would too. I tried to shake off my unease, telling myself I was being paranoid. This was a public place after all, and I was probably just hyper-aware as a woman traveling alone. After I finished my meal, I decided to head back to my Airbnb. As I walked out of the restaurant, I felt a chill run down my spine when I saw the man stand up and begin putting on his jacket. I picked up my pace, weaving through the busy streets filled with tourists and locals enjoying the nightlife. Every time I glanced back, my heart sank as I spotted him about half a block behind me. He wasn't even trying to be subtle anymore. His eyes were locked on me as he followed my exact path. I ducked into a small shop, pretending to browse while I tried to calm my racing thoughts. After a few minutes, I peeked out the window and saw him standing across the street, waiting. Panic started to set in. I was still a 15-minute walk from my Airbnb, and the streets were getting quieter as I moved away from the main tourist area. I considered calling an Uber, but was worried about standing still long enough for one to arrive. So, I took a deep breath, steeled my nerves, and decided to make a run for it. I burst out of the shop and took off down the street as fast as I could in my sandals. I could hear heavy footsteps behind me, getting closer. My lungs were burning and my legs felt like jelly, but pure adrenaline kept me going. I made random turns down side streets, trying to lose him. Finally, I reached my Airbnb and fumbled with shaking hands to unlock the door. I slammed it behind me and collapsed against it, gasping for air. Through the window, I saw a figure pause at the end of the driveway, looking toward the house. Then he slowly walked away. I was trembling uncontrollably as I double-checked all the locks and closed all the curtains. I tried to tell myself I was safe now, but I couldn't shake the feeling of violation. This man had seen where I was staying. What if he came back? I barely slept that night, jumping at every little sound. As the sky began to lighten, I started to relax slightly, thinking I had made it through the night. But then I heard it, a soft tapping sound coming from the bedroom window. My blood ran cold as I slowly turned my head. There he was, the man from the restaurant, pressing his face against the glass and staring right at me with a twisted smile. I screamed and ran out of the room, tripping over my suitcase in my panic to get to my phone. With shaking fingers, I managed to dial the local police. I tried to explain the situation through my sobs, praying they would understand my broken Spanish. When I went back to check, the man was gone, but a handprint remained on the window. The police arrived about 20 minutes later. They took my statement and looked around the property, but found no sign of the intruder. They promised to increase patrols in the area, but I could tell they didn't take me very seriously. One officer even suggested I had too much to drink and imagined it. I spent the rest of the day huddled on the couch, afraid to move or make a sound. Every creak of the house made me flinch. As night fell, the terror became unbearable. I couldn't stand the thought of spending another night there, wondering if he would come back. With tears streaming down my face, I booked the first flight home I could find, not caring about the exorbitant last-minute fare. I called an Uber and waited by the door with my hastily packed bag, ready to bolt at a moment's notice. The drive to the airport was a blur. I kept looking over my shoulder, half expecting to see the man's car following us. It wasn't until I was through security and waiting at my gate that I finally let out the breath I'd been holding. As I settled into my seat on the plane, a mix of relief and disappointment washed over me. I was glad to be heading home to safety, but I couldn't help feeling robbed of the amazing solo travel experience I had dreamed about for so long. The incident left me shaken for months. I had nightmares about the man's face in the window, waking up in a cold sweat. I became hyper-vigilant, always looking over my shoulder, even in familiar places. The carefree, adventurous spirit that had driven me to take this trip in the first place felt crushed. It took a lot of time and therapy to process what happened. I struggled with feelings of shame and self-doubt. Should I have been more careful? Did I do something to attract his attention? I know now that it wasn't my fault, but in those early days, the self-blame was overwhelming. Gradually, I've started to heal. I've shared my story with other women travelers, hoping to raise awareness about the unique dangers we can face. I've also worked on rebuilding my confidence and sense of independence. While I haven't given up on travel entirely, I approach it differently now. I'm more cautious about traveling alone, especially in unfamiliar places. I make sure to thoroughly research safety tips for female travelers and always have a solid plan for emergencies. Sometimes I still think about that night in Costa Rica and wonder what might have happened if things had gone differently. The fear and vulnerability I felt in those moments will stay with me forever. But I'm determined not to let it define me or limit my life. I hope that by sharing my experience, I can help other solo female travelers stay safe and prepared. No one should have to go through what I did. Travel can be an incredibly rewarding experience, but it's crucial to be aware of the risks and take precautions. To this day, I can't explain why that man targeted me or what his intentions were. Was he just trying to scare me, or did he have something more sinister in mind? I'll never know, and in a way, that uncertainty is almost worse than knowing. The incident serves as a stark reminder that even in seemingly safe and touristy areas, dangers can lurk. It taught me the importance of trusting my instincts and not dismissing that nagging feeling when something doesn't feel right. While I wish I could go back and finish my Costa Rica trip the way I had planned, I've come to accept that it wasn't meant to be. Instead, I focus on the lessons I've learned and how I can use my experience to help others. I still have moments of anxiety, especially when I'm alone in unfamiliar places. But I'm working on not letting fear control my life. I'm slowly regaining my love for travel and adventure, albeit with a much more cautious approach. If there's one thing I want others to take away from my story, it's this. Stay aware of your surroundings, trust your gut, and don't be afraid to ask for help if you feel unsafe. Your safety is always more important than worrying about overreacting or offending someone. I often wonder if I'll ever see that man again, or if he's out there terrorizing other solo female travelers. It's a chilling thought, but I try not to dwell on it. Instead, I focus on the present and the future, grateful for the second chance I've been given. My experience in Costa Rica changed me in ways I'm still discovering. While it was traumatic, it also taught me valuable lessons about resilience, self-reliance, and the importance of community. I'm stronger now, but I'll never forget the vulnerability I felt in those terrifying moments. As I continue to heal and grow from this experience, I hold on to hope. Hope that I'll fully reclaim my love for travel and adventure. Hope that by sharing my story, I can help prevent similar incidents from happening to others. And hope that one day, women will be able to explore the world freely without fear. I was fresh out of culinary school when I landed my dream job at Le Petit Jardin, one of the most exclusive fine dining restaurants in the city. The executive chef, Marco Bellini, was a culinary legend known for his innovative fusion of French and Italian cuisine. I was thrilled to be working under him, eager to learn and prove myself. From day one, the atmosphere in the kitchen was intense. Marco ran a tight ship, barking orders and scrutinizing every dish with an eagle eye. But there was something else, an underlying current of tension I couldn't quite put my finger on. The other chefs seemed on edge, exchanging furtive glances when Marco's back was turned. About a month into the job, I started noticing odd things. Marco would disappear into the walk-in refrigerator for long stretches, emerging looking drained and disheveled. Sometimes I caught whiffs of strange, acrid smells coming from there. Once I could have sworn I heard chanting. But the strangest thing was the customers. Night after night, the dining room was packed with the same faces. I'd never seen such loyalty, people coming back 3-4 times a week to drop hundreds on a meal. And they all had this glassy-eyed, almost trance-like look as they ate. One night I was prepping for dinner service when I realized I'd left my phone in my locker. As I headed to the back, I passed the walk-in and heard Marco's voice inside. He was speaking in a language I didn't recognize, guttural and rhythmic. Curiosity got the better of me, and I cracked open the door. What I saw made my blood run cold. In the center of the refrigerator, Marco had cleared a space and set up some kind of altar. Candles flickered, casting eerie shadows on the hanging meat. There were strange symbols drawn on the floor in what looked disturbingly like blood. And Marco was kneeling before it all, swaying as he chanted. I must have gasped because his head snapped around. For a moment, his eyes looked completely black in the dim light. Then he blinked, and they were normal again. "Ah, my young apprentice," he said smoothly, rising to his feet. Come in, come in. I suppose it's time you learned the secret to our success." Every instinct screamed at me to run, but I was rooted to the spot as Marco ushered me inside and closed the door behind us. "You see," he began, gesturing to the macabre altar, "cooking is more than just ingredients and technique. It's about feeding the soul, and I've found a way to do that, quite literally." He went on to explain, in chilling detail, how he had discovered ancient rituals that allowed him to infuse the food with supernatural energy. Each dish contained a tiny fragment of customers' life force, binding them to the restaurant in an endless cycle of consumption. "That's why they keep coming back," Marco said, his eyes gleaming with a fanatical light. "They're addicted to the feeling, desperate to reclaim what they've lost. And with each meal, they lose a little more of themselves to us." I felt sick to my stomach. All those vacant-eyed patrons trapped in Marco's twisted game, and I had been unknowingly complicit, helping prepare the very dishes that ensnared them. But that's evil," I stammered. "You're stealing people's souls." Marco laughed, a cold, hollow sound that echoed off the steel walls. "Evil? No, my dear. I'm elevating the culinary arts to their highest form. These people lead empty lives, chasing fleeting pleasures. I give them transcendence." He stepped closer, looming over me. "And now that you know, you have a choice to make. Join me, learn the old ways, and become part of something greater than yourself. Or—" The threat hung unspoken in the air. I knew in that moment that if I refused, I'd likely end up as the main ingredient in tomorrow's special. Time seemed to stand still as my mind raced. Then, operating on pure instinct, I grabbed a nearby meat hook and swung it at Marco's head. He ducked, but it gave me the opening I needed. I bolted for the door, yanking it open and sprinting through the kitchen. Shouts erupted behind me as I barreled past bewildered staff. I didn't stop to grab my things or explain. I just ran as if the hounds of hell were at my heels. And in a way, they were. I didn't feel safe until I was locked in my apartment, gasping for breath. My hands shook as I called the police, but even as the words tumbled out, I knew how insane it all sounded. Rituals? Soul-stealing? They'd think I was having a psychotic break. In the end, I hung up without filing a report. What could I even say? I had no proof, just the ramblings of a terrified culinary school grad. I spent that night huddled on my couch, jumping at every sound. By morning, I'd made up my mind. I packed a bag, emptied my meager savings account, and bought a bus ticket to my aunt's place, 3 states away. It's been 5 years since that night, and I still have nightmares about Marco's black eyes and that blood-smeared altar. I've never gone back to professional cooking. Can't stand the sight of a kitchen now. Sometimes I'm tempted to look up Le Petit Jardin online to see if it's still in business, but I'm too afraid of what I might find. I don't know if Marco is still out there, trapping souls in his exquisite dishes. I don't know if anyone ever discovered his terrible secret. All I know is that I escaped, and I thank my lucky stars for that every day. But a part of me will always wonder about those poor souls left behind, forever bound to that cursed restaurant, slowly fading away with each perfect poisonous bite. I was so excited for our 3-day fishing trip on Carson's new luxury boat. He'd been bragging about it for weeks, a 40-foot cruiser with all the amenities. Rick, Mike, and I packed our gear and headed out to the marina early Friday morning, ready for a guy's weekend on the water. The weather was perfect as we set off, blue skies and a light breeze. We cracked open some beers and joked around as Carson navigated us out to our fishing spot about 20 miles offshore. By early afternoon, we'd caught a few decent-sized fish and were in high spirits. Around 4 p.m., we noticed another boat approaching. It was a small, beat-up fishing vessel that looked like it had seen better days. As it got closer, I could make out 2 scruffy-looking men on board. They waved at us, and Carson slowed our boat so they could pull up alongside. "Hey there," one of the men called out. He looked to be in his 50s, with a graying beard and weathered face. "We're running low on gas and supplies. Any chance you fellas could spare some?" Carson glanced at us uncertainly. We had plenty of extra food and fuel, but something about these guys made me uneasy. Still, it seemed wrong to turn away someone in need out on the water. "Sure, we can help you out," Carson replied after a moment. "What do you need?" The men asked for some gas, water, and food. We filled up a few gas cans for them and put together a box of supplies, bottles of water, sandwiches, chips, etc. As we passed it over to their boat, I got a better look at the second man. He was younger, probably mid-30s, with dark hair and piercing eyes that seemed to take in every detail of our boat and gear. "Much appreciated," the older man said. "We misjudged how long we'd be out here. You boys enjoy your trip now." With that, they fired up their engine and puttered away. We watched them go, an odd silence falling over our group. "Well, that was weird," Rick finally said. "Did anyone else get a strange vibe from those guys?" We all nodded in agreement. There was just something off about the encounter that I couldn't quite put my finger on. But we shrugged it off and got back to fishing, trying to recapture our earlier carefree mood. As the sun began to set, Carson suggested we anchor for the night in a sheltered cove about a mile away. We secured the boat and grilled up some of our catch for dinner. Afterwards, we sat out on the deck, having a few more beers and swapping stories under the stars. Despite the alcohol, I couldn't fully relax. I kept scanning the dark water, half expecting to see that old boat appear again. Around midnight, we decided to turn in. The boat had 2 small cabins. Carson and Rick took one, while Mike and I got the other. I tossed and turned for a while before finally drifting off into an uneasy sleep. I'm not sure how long I'd been out when a noise jolted me awake. Holding my breath, I listened intently. There it was again, a soft thud from somewhere on the boat. My heart began to race. I reached over and shook Mike's shoulder. "Mike," I whispered urgently, "wake up. I think I heard something." He stirred groggily. "Huh? What's going on?" "Shh, listen." We lay there silently for a few moments. Then we heard it, quiet footsteps moving across the deck above us. Mike's eyes went wide with fear. "Someone's on the boat," he mouthed silently. Adrenaline surging, I eased out of bed and crept to the cabin door. I opened it a crack and peered out into the main living area. In the dim light, I could make out a figure rummaging through our bags and belongings. My blood ran cold as I recognized the younger man from earlier. What the hell were they doing back here? I quickly shut the door and turned to Mike. "It's those guys from before," I whispered. "They're stealing our stuff." Mike looked terrified. "What do we do?" I tried to think through our options. We were outnumbered, and who knows if they were armed. Confronting them seemed too risky. "Let's wake Carson and Rick," I said. "Maybe we can catch them off guard." We silently made our way to the other cabin and roused our friends. In hushed tones, we explained the situation. Carson's face hardened with anger. "Those bastards," he growled. "I've got a flare gun in my bag. We'll surprise them and scare them off." But when we cautiously emerged from the cabins, the main area was empty. Our bags had clearly been rifled through, with contents strewn about. We did a quick search of the boat, but found no sign of the intruders. They must have heard us stirring and fled. We spent the next hour taking stock of what was missing. Some cash, Carson's expensive watch, a few other valuables. But it seemed like they'd been interrupted before getting everything. As we stood there processing what had happened, Mike suddenly went pale. "Guys," he said shakily, "when I woke up earlier to use the bathroom, I think one of them was in our room watching us sleep. I saw a shadow by the door but assumed I was dreaming. Oh God." A chill ran down my spine. The thought of those men lurking over us while we slept was terrifying. What were their true intentions? Simple robbery or something far more sinister? Nobody slept for the rest of the night. We took turns keeping watch, jumping at every little sound. I've never felt fear like that, trapped on a boat miles from shore, knowing those men were out there somewhere. As soon as the sun rose, Carson started the engine and we hightailed it back to the marina. The carefree fishing trip we'd envisioned had turned into a nightmare. We reported the incident to the police, but with so little to go on, I doubt anything will come of it. It's been a few weeks now, but I still have trouble sleeping. I keep replaying that night in my head, imagining all the horrible things that could have happened. Why did they come back? What would they have done if we hadn't woken up? The not knowing is almost worse than anything else. I used to love being out on the water, but now the thought of it fills me with dread. Carson's trying to convince us to give it another shot, says we can't let one bad experience ruin it. But I don't think I'll ever feel safe on a boat again. Those men are still out there somewhere, and next time we might not be so lucky. I was always close to my grandpa, so when he suggested we go fishing together at a remote lake, I jumped at the chance. At 84 years old, he didn't get out much anymore, but he insisted he was feeling spry enough for a day trip. I was a bit surprised when he suggested this particular lake, though. It was one I'd never heard him mention before, despite all the fishing stories he'd told me over the years. "It's been ages since I've been there," he said with an odd note in his voice. "But it used to be one of my favorite spots. Nice and quiet, hardly anyone knows about it." We set out early that morning, driving a couple hours into the mountains. The lake was indeed remote. We had to take a bumpy dirt road for the last few miles, winding through thick forest. When we finally reached the shore, I was struck by how still and dark the water looked. Not a ripple disturbed the glassy surface. Dense trees pressed in close to the water's edge, their shadows making the lake seem even darker. "Well, here we are," Grandpa said, his tone oddly flat. He seemed to be avoiding looking directly at the water. We unloaded our gear and found a good spot to set up. As I baited my hook, I noticed Grandpa's hands shaking slightly. I chalked it up to his age, but there was a tension in his movements that seemed out of place for a relaxing fishing trip. For the first hour or so, we fished in relative silence. The quiet felt heavy somehow, oppressive. No birds sang in the surrounding woods. Even the insects seemed muted. The only sound was the occasional plop of our lines hitting the water. "You ever catch anything big here, Grandpa?" I asked, trying to lighten the mood. He was quiet for a long moment before answering. "Used to be good fishing, but it's been a long time." I waited for him to elaborate, maybe launch into one of his usual fishing tales, but he just stared out at the water with a faraway look in his eyes. As the morning wore on, I began to feel increasingly uneasy. There was something off about this place that I couldn't quite put my finger on. The air felt thick and clammy on my skin. Every so often, I'd catch movement out of the corner of my eye, only to turn and see nothing there. I was about to suggest we call it a day when I saw it, a pale shape moving just beneath the surface of the water, maybe 20 feet from shore. At first I thought it was a large fish, but as it drew closer, my blood ran cold. It was a face, a human face, deathly pale and distorted by the water. As I watched in frozen horror, it rose slowly toward the surface, revealing more of itself. Sunken, cloudy eyes stared sightlessly in my direction. Blue-tinged lips parted as if to speak. I let out a strangled yell and scrambled backwards, dropping my fishing rod. "Grandpa, there's someone in the water!" He was on his feet in an instant, moving with a speed that belied his age. When he saw what I was pointing at, all the color drained from his face. "Oh, God, it's back," he whispered. "We need to leave, now." I didn't need to be told twice. We grabbed our gear and practically ran back to the car. As we sped away down the dirt road, I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see that awful face pursuing us. Once we were back on the main highway, I finally felt like I could breathe again. My hands were shaking as I gripped the steering wheel. "What the hell was that, Grandpa? We need to call the police or something. There could be a body in there." He shook his head slowly. It's not a normal drowning victim. That thing has been in that lake for a long, long time." A chill ran down my spine at his words. "What do you mean? How do you know about it?" He sighed heavily, suddenly looking every one of his 84 years. "I should have told you before we went, but I hoped maybe it was gone after all this time." Over the next hour as we drove home, he told me a story that made my skin crawl. Apparently, back when my grandpa was a young man, that lake had been a popular swimming and fishing spot for locals. But one summer, a 10-year-old boy went missing while swimming there. They searched for days, dragging the lake, but never found a body. "That's when the stories started," Grandpa said. People said they saw things in the water, pale faces watching them from just below the surface, hands reaching up from the depths. Most folks wrote it off as grief and wild imaginations, but I knew better. He went on to describe how he and a few other men from town had gone back to the lake late one night, determined to find out the truth. What they saw still haunted him decades later. It was like the lake came alive, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Dozens of faces in the water, all around us, men, women, children. Some looked like they'd been there for centuries, and they were hungry, trying to lure us in. They'd barely escaped with their lives that night. Afterward, they'd done their best to scare people away from the lake, spreading rumors of pollution and dangerous wildlife. Eventually, the road fell into disrepair, and most people forgot the place even existed. I thought it was safe after all these years, Grandpa said. I'm so sorry I brought you there. I should have known better. I didn't know what to say. Part of me wanted to rationalize it all away, a trick of the light, an overactive imagination. But I knew what I'd seen. That face in the water had been all too real. We rode in silence for a while, both lost in our own thoughts. As we neared home, Grandpa spoke up again. "Promise me you won't go back there," he said, his voice urgent. "And don't tell anyone else about it either. That place, it has a way of calling to people. The more who know, the more it can lure in." I nodded, still trying to process everything I'd learned. "I promise, Grandpa. But what about other people who might stumble across it?" He shook his head. "We've done our best to keep it hidden all these years. Hopefully that's enough. Some things are better left alone." As we pulled into my grandpa's driveway, I couldn't shake the feeling that our ordeal wasn't truly over. That night, and for many nights after, I dreamed of dark water and pale, grasping hands reaching up to drag me down into the depths. I've kept my promise to Grandpa. I've never gone back to that lake, and I've never told anyone else this story until now. But sometimes, when I'm near any body of water, I catch myself scanning the surface, half expecting to see those awful cloudy eyes staring back at me. I don't know what lives in that forgotten lake. I don't want to know. But I do know this. There are places in this world that are best left undisturbed. Dark corners where ancient, hungry things lie in wait. And sometimes, the most peaceful-looking waters hide the darkest secrets. I was never much of an outdoorsman, but my dad lived for those fishing trips out on Loch Morgan Lake. Every other weekend, like clockwork, he'd load up his beat-up old pickup with tackle boxes and coolers and head out before dawn. I'd get a call Sunday evening. "Caught a real beauty today, son. You should have seen it." I'd smile and nod, even though I couldn't tell a bass from a bluegill. That's why I didn't think much of it when Dad didn't call that Sunday. Figured the fish weren't biting, or he'd lost track of time. But when Monday morning rolled around and still no word, a knot of worry started forming in my gut. I called the cabin where he always stayed, but no answer. His cell went straight to voicemail. By Monday afternoon, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was very wrong. I hopped in my car and made the 3-hour drive up to Loch Morgan, my mind racing the whole way. Dad was experienced. He knew that lake like the back of his hand, but he wasn't getting any younger. What if he'd had a heart attack out there, fallen and hit his head? I tried to stay calm, told myself I was overreacting, but deep down, I knew. The sun was setting by the time I pulled into the gravel lot by the boat launch. Dad's old Ford was still there, covered in a fine layer of dust. I went to the cabin first, hoping against hope that he'd just lost his phone or something. But it was empty, bed still made, no sign he'd been there in days. With shaking hands, I called the local sheriff's office. They said they'd send someone out first thing in the morning to take a report and start searching. But I couldn't wait that long. I found the spare key to Dad's boat and set out onto the darkening lake. The water was calm, eerily still. Mist hung low over the surface, muffling sound. I navigated slowly, sweeping my flashlight back and forth, calling out for Dad until my voice was hoarse. Hours passed, and the knot in my stomach grew tighter with each passing minute. It was well past midnight when I saw it, a faint glint of metal in my flashlight beam. As I drew closer, my blood ran cold. It was Dad's boat, drifting aimlessly in the middle of the lake. I pulled alongside and clambered aboard with trembling legs. The sight that greeted me will haunt me for the rest of my days. Everything was exactly as Dad would have left it. Tackle box open, half-empty thermos of coffee, even his lucky hat still perched on the seat. But of Dad himself, there was no trace. It was as if he'd simply vanished into thin air. I searched that boat inch by inch, growing more frantic by the second. No sign of a struggle, no blood, nothing to indicate what might have happened. Just emptiness. I collapsed onto the floor of the boat, my mind reeling. This couldn't be happening. People don't just disappear. The rest of that night passed in a blur. I remember the flashing lights of police boats, the grim faces of the search and rescue team. They combed every inch of that lake over the next few days. Divers scoured the murky depths, but they found nothing. No body, no clues, nothing to explain what had happened to my father. The official report called it an accidental drowning. They said he must have fallen overboard somehow, that currents could have carried the body away. But I couldn't accept that. Dad was a strong swimmer, and he always wore his life jacket. It just didn't add up. As the days turned to weeks, I found myself unable to let it go. I took leave from work, rented a cabin by the lake. I spent every waking hour out on the water, searching, though I didn't know what for. At night, fitful sleep was plagued by vivid, terrifying dreams. In these nightmares, I'd see Dad struggling in dark, murky water, but it wasn't like normal drowning. Inky black tentacles seemed to be dragging him down into the depths. He'd reach out to me, eyes wide with terror, mouth opening in a silent scream. I'd try to grab his hand, but always woke up just before I could reach him, drenched in cold sweat. These dreams felt so real, so visceral, that I became convinced they were more than just nightmares. Was Dad somehow reaching out to me, trying to tell me what had really happened? The rational part of my brain said I was losing it, that grief was warping my mind. But I couldn't shake the feeling that there was something more going on, something beyond normal explanation. I started talking to locals, old-timers who'd lived by the lake their whole lives. At first, they were hesitant, eyeing me warily. But as the weeks wore on and they saw my dedication, they began to open up. They spoke in hushed tones of old legends, stories passed down through generations. They told tales of people going missing on the lake over the years, experienced boaters and swimmers who vanished without a trace. They spoke of strange lights seen in the depths on moonless nights, of inhuman wails echoing across the water. One old woman, her eyes clouded with cataracts, gripped my arm with surprising strength. "There's something in that lake," she wheezed. "Something old, something hungry." I tried to dismiss it as superstition, the ramblings of isolated country folk. But the more time I spent on that lake, the more I felt watched. There were moments when the water would go preternaturally still, as if holding its breath. times when my skin would prickle with goosebumps despite the warm sun. Once I could have sworn I saw something massive moving in the depths, just at the edge of visibility. But when I looked closer, there was nothing there. Weeks turned to months. Friends and family begged me to come home, to accept what had happened and try to move on. But I couldn't. Every time I thought about leaving, those nightmares would come again, more vivid than ever. Dad reaching out, silently pleading for help. I'd wake up in a cold sweat, heart pounding, more convinced than ever that he was still out there somewhere. I became obsessed, spending every waking moment researching the lake's history, poring over old newspapers and local records. I found more disappearances stretching back decades, all hushed up or explained away. I started mapping them, looking for patterns. Was it my imagination, or did they seem to cluster around certain areas of the lake? My appearance began to deteriorate. I lost weight. My beard grew wild and unkempt. Dark circles formed under my eyes from lack of sleep. The locals who had once been sympathetic now avoided me, crossing the street when they saw me coming. I heard whispers. Poor guy's gone off the deep end. But I didn't care. I knew I was onto something. I had to be. One night, about 6 months after Dad disappeared, I had the most vivid dream yet. I saw him clearly, trapped in some kind of underwater cave. But this time, he spoke. "The island," he said, his voice garbled as if coming from far away. "Granite Island, that's where it lives." I woke with a start, those words echoing in my mind. Granite Island. It was a small, rocky outcropping near the center of the lake. Uninhabited, too small for much of anything. I'd passed it 100 times in my searches, never giving it a second thought. But now, without hesitation, I jumped in my boat and headed out, heedless of the fact that it was the middle of the night. As I approached the island, the lake seemed to come alive around me. The water churned and bubbled in a way I'd never seen before. My little boat rocked violently, nearly capsizing several times. And then I saw it, a massive shape rising from the depths near the island. It was like nothing I'd ever seen before, part squid, part eel, but as big as a house. Countless tentacles writhed in the air, and I caught a glimpse of a gaping maw lined with razor-sharp teeth. I froze, paralyzed with terror. This couldn't be real. It had to be a hallucination, a product of my grief-addled mind. But deep down, I knew. This was what had taken my father. This was the dark secret of Loch Morgan Lake. For a moment that stretched into eternity, the creature and I regarded each other. Those alien eyes seemed to bore into my very soul. I felt a vast, ancient intelligence there, something so far beyond human comprehension that my mind recoiled from it. And then, as suddenly as it had appeared, it was gone. The thing sank back into the depths with barely a ripple, leaving the lake as calm and placid as ever. I sat there, shaking uncontrollably, for what felt like hours. When the sun finally rose, I half convinced myself it had all been a dream. But I knew, deep in my bones, that it wasn't. I'd seen the truth of what lurked in Loch Morgan Lake, the terrible reality of what had happened to my father. I left that day and never went back. Oh, I tried to tell people what I'd seen, but of course no one believed me. They nodded sympathetically, eyes filled with pity for the man driven mad by grief. Eventually, I stopped trying, but I've never forgotten. Some nights, I still wake up in a cold sweat, the image of that monstrous shape seared into my mind. I think about my dad, about all the others who disappeared in that lake over the years, and I wonder, is it still out there, waiting? How long before it gets hungry again? I don't know if I'll ever have answers. All I know is that I'll never look at a calm lake the same way again, because now I know what horrors might be lurking just beneath the surface, waiting to pull the unwary down into the depths. About halfway through my hour-long drive, the gaslight came on. Cursing under my breath, I peered at the GPS on my phone, searching for the nearest gas station. There was one about 10 miles ahead. It would be cutting it close, but I thought I could make it. As I pulled into the small, dimly lit gas station, a sense of unease washed over me. The place looked deserted, with only a couple flickering fluorescent lights illuminating the pump area. No other cars were in sight. I quickly got out to fill up my tank, trying to shake off the creepy vibes. While I was pumping gas, I had the distinct feeling of being watched. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I glanced around nervously but didn't see anyone. Still, I couldn't shake the sensation of eyes boring into me from the darkness beyond the lit area. I finished pumping as fast as I could and practically ran inside to pay, my heart pounding. The bored-looking clerk barely looked up from his phone as he rang me up. I debated mentioning the weird feeling to him, but decided I was just being paranoid. As I walked back to my car, I noticed something white stuck under the windshield wiper. Frowning, I plucked it out. It was a small slip of paper. My blood ran cold as I read the words scrawled in messy handwriting. "I'm here." I whipped my head around, searching frantically for any sign of someone nearby, but the station was still eerily empty and silent. With shaking hands, I crumpled up the note and tossed it away before jumping in my car and peeling out of there as fast as I could. My mind was racing as I sped down the dark highway. Who could have left that note? I hadn't seen a single other person at the station. Had someone been hiding, watching me the whole time? The thought made me feel sick. I kept checking my rearview mirror obsessively, half expecting to see headlights gaining on me. But the road behind remained empty and dark. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone, that whoever left that note was somehow still out there, following me. About 20 minutes later, I breathed a sigh of relief as I turned onto the familiar streets of my neighborhood. The streetlights and cozy houses were a welcome sight after the isolated darkness of the highway. I started to relax a little, thinking I was safe now that I was almost home. But as I pulled into my driveway, my heart nearly stopped. There, tucked under my windshield wiper, was another slip of paper. With trembling fingers, I unfolded it to read, "I'm still here." Panic seized me. I fumbled for my phone, ready to call 911, when movement caught my eye. A figure darted across my front lawn, disappearing into the shadows between houses. I let out a strangled cry and dove into my car, locking the doors. My fingers shook so badly I could barely dial. When the 911 operator answered, I frantically explained the situation, the notes, the figure I'd seen. They said they'd send a patrol car right away. I sat in my locked car, too terrified to go inside my house. Every shadow, every rustle of leaves in the breeze made me flinch. My eyes darted constantly between the rear view and side mirrors, searching for any sign of movement. After what felt like an eternity, a police cruiser finally pulled up. 2 officers got out and approached my car. I showed them the note and described everything that had happened. They did a thorough search of my property and the surrounding area, but found no sign of an intruder. One of the officers gently suggested that perhaps I had imagined the figure in my stressed state. The other pointed out that the handwriting on both notes looked different, implying they may not be connected. They seemed skeptical of my story, which only added to my frustration and fear. In the end, they said they'd increase patrols in the area tonight, but that there wasn't much else they could do without evidence of an actual crime. They encouraged me to call again if anything else happened. I watched them drive away, feeling utterly alone and exposed. How could I possibly go into my house now, knowing someone might be out there watching? But I couldn't just sit in my car all night either. Taking a deep breath, I made a dash for my front door, fumbling with my keys before practically falling inside. I slammed the door shut behind me and engaged every lock. I spent the next few hours methodically checking every room, closet, and possible hiding place in my house. I drew all the curtains tightly closed and turned on every light. My normally cozy home felt like a cage, and every creak and groan of the house settling made me jump. Sleep was out of the question. I stationed myself in the living room, where I had the best view of both the front and back of the house. I kept my phone clutched in my hand, 911 already dialed and ready to hit send at a moment's notice. As the night wore on, my eyes grew heavy, but terror kept me awake. Every time I started to drift off, I'd jerk back awake, certain I'd heard a noise. The shadows seemed to move and shift in the corners of my vision. Around 3 a.m., I heard the unmistakable sound of a car engine. Peering through a crack in the curtains, I saw a dark sedan slowly cruise by my house, then come to a stop directly across the street. The engine cut off, but no one got out. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might burst out of my chest. Was this them? The person who'd been leaving the notes? What were they waiting for? I debated calling the police again, but hesitated. What if they came and found nothing again? Would they even believe me this time? So I sat there, rigid with fear, watching that car. It didn't move. No one got in or out. It just sat there, like a malevolent presence. Hours passed like this. As the sky began to lighten with the approaching dawn, I must have dozed off for a few minutes. When I snapped awake, the car was gone. I spent the entire next day in a haze of exhaustion and lingering fear. I called in sick to work, unable to bring myself to leave the relative safety of my house. I found myself constantly peeking out windows, starting at every little noise. That night, I couldn't bear to be alone. I called a friend and asked if I could stay at their place, making up an excuse about a pest problem in my house. I didn't tell them the real reason. I was too embarrassed and afraid they wouldn't believe me. The next few days passed without incident. No more notes appeared. I didn't see the mysterious car again. Slowly, I started to wonder if maybe I had blown the whole thing out of proportion. Had it all just been a series of coincidences that my scared mind had twisted into something sinister? But even now, weeks later, I can't shake the feeling of being watched. I find myself constantly looking over my shoulder, unable to relax even in my own home. I've installed security cameras and extra locks, but they do little to ease my paranoia. The rational part of my brain says it's over, that there was probably never any real threat. But late at night, when the house is quiet and the shadows seem to move, I can almost hear a whisper, "I'm still here." That particular night started off pretty normal. Around 2 a.m., the bell above the door chimed as a customer walked in. I glanced up from restocking the chip aisle to see a tall man in a dark coat. Nothing too unusual there. "Evening," I called out. "Let me know if you need any help." The man didn't respond or even look my way. He just slowly walked down one of the aisles, hands in his pockets. I shrugged it off. Some folks aren't chatty, especially at this hour. I went back to stocking, but kept an eye on him in my peripheral vision. After a few minutes, I realized he was just standing there, in the middle of the aisle, not looking at products or anything, just standing perfectly still. A chill ran down my spine. I cleared my throat. Sir? You all right there?" Still no response. I set down my box of chips and walked over, heart starting to race a bit. As I turned the corner, I saw him standing ramrod straight, staring intently at a rack of beef jerky. His eyes were wide open, unblinking. "Sir?" I said again, louder this time. "Can I help you find something?" Slowly, so slowly, he turned his head to look at me. His eyes were pale, almost colorless. A small smile crept across his face, but it didn't reach those dead eyes. "Just browsing," he said in a low, raspy voice. Then he turned and walked out, not buying a thing. I let out a breath I didn't realize I'd been holding. What a weirdo, I thought. But hey, you get all types on the night shift. I tried to shake off the uneasy feeling and went back to work. A couple nights later, I was wiping down the coffee station when I heard the door chime. I turned to greet the customer and felt my stomach drop. It was him again. Same dark coat, same emotionless face. This time he went straight to the back of the store, near the refrigerated section. I kept a close eye on him as I pretended to organize the coffee stirrers. He stood in front of the energy drinks, completely motionless, for at least 10 minutes. I was seriously creeped out now, but I didn't want to confront him. I busied myself behind the counter, stealing glances every few seconds. Finally, he turned and walked towards me. I plastered on my best retail smile. "Find everything okay?" He placed a single can of Red Bull on the counter. As I rang him up, I noticed his hands. Long, pale fingers with nails bitten to the quick. They drummed an odd rhythm on the countertop. "That'll be $3.50, I said, voice wavering slightly. He pulled out exact change and placed it on the counter, one coin at a time. Then he leaned in close. I could smell stale cigarettes on his breath. "You work here every night?" he asked in that sandpaper voice. I swallowed hard. Most nights, yeah." He nodded slowly, eyes boring into mine. "Good to know." Then he was gone, leaving the Red Bull on the counter. I immediately called my manager and asked if I could get someone to cover my shifts for a while. But we were short-staffed and I needed the money. So I kept working, but I was constantly on edge. For the next week, nothing happened. No sign of the creepy guy. I started to relax a little, thinking maybe it was just a weird coincidence. Then came the night that still gives me nightmares. It was about 3:30 a.m. I was in the back room, grabbing some boxes to restock the candy aisle. As I turned to head back out front, I nearly jumped out of my skin. He was standing in the doorway, blocking my exit. "Jesus!" I yelped, dropping the boxes. "How did you get back here?" He tilted his head, regarding me with those empty eyes. "I've been watching you," he said matter-of-factly. "I know your routines." My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might burst out of my chest. I tried to keep my voice steady. "Sir, you can't be back here. Employees only." He took a step closer. I instinctively backed up until I hit the shelving unit behind me. "Do you ever feel alone here at night?" he asked, ignoring my words. "Vulnerable?" I fumbled in my pocket for my phone, ready to call 911. "You need to leave, now, or I'm calling the cops." He smiled that awful smile again. "No need for that. I'm not here to hurt you. I just want you to know that I'm always watching, always." With that, he turned and walked out. I heard the bell chime as he exited the store. I slumped to the floor, shaking uncontrollably. I didn't care about being short-staffed anymore. I called my manager right then and there and quit on the spot. For weeks after, I jumped at every shadow. I changed my routines, varied my schedule. but I could never shake the feeling of being watched. Even now, months later, I still catch glimpses of a tall figure in a dark coat out of the corner of my eye. When I turn to look, there's never anyone there, but I know he's out there somewhere, watching and waiting. I don't know what he wanted or why he fixated on me. Maybe he was just a lonely, disturbed person. Maybe he got some thrill out of scaring people. Or maybe he had something much worse planned that I narrowly avoided by quitting. All I know is that I'll never work another night shift as long as I live. And I always check the back seat of my car before getting in. To this day, I can't shake the memory of those pale, unblinking eyes. Sometimes I wake up in a cold sweat, feeling them on me in the darkness. I've tried to rationalize it, to tell myself it was just some creep trying to scare me. But deep down, I know there was something truly wrong about that man, something inhuman. I've thought about reporting it to the police, but what would I even say? Some guy scared me at work? I have no proof, no evidence of any actual crime, just my word and my lingering fear. I've talked to a therapist about it, trying to process the trauma. She says it's a normal reaction to a threatening situation, that with time, the fear will fade. But she doesn't understand. She didn't see those eyes, didn't feel the malevolence radiating off him. I've tried to move on with my life. I found a new job, working days at a busy retail store where I'm never alone. I've made new friends, started new hobbies, but I can never fully relax. Part of me is always on alert, always watching for that dark coat and those dead eyes. Sometimes I wonder if I imagined the whole thing. If the long, lonely nights and lack of sleep just made me paranoid. But then I'll catch a whiff of stale cigarettes on the wind or see a tall figure in my peripheral vision, and the terror comes rushing back. I don't know if I'll ever feel truly safe again. That man, whoever or whatever he was, took something from me that night. My sense of security, my peace of mind. And the worst part is, I don't think he's done with me yet. So I keep looking over my shoulder, keep varying my routines, and I pray that someday, somehow, I'll be free of the lingering dread that follows me like a shadow. But deep down, I know the truth. He's still out there, still watching, and I don't think he'll ever stop. As I rounded a bend, I saw the glow of lights up ahead. A gas station. Thank God. My tank was running low, and I desperately needed coffee to keep me awake. I pulled off the highway and into the dimly lit parking lot. The place looked deserted, but a flickering, open 24 hours sign gave me hope. I got out of my car and stretched, my muscles stiff from sitting for so long. The night air was cool and still, too still. I suddenly felt very alone and exposed under the harsh fluorescent lights. Shaking off the unease, I walked towards the convenience store attached to the gas station. As I approached the door, movement caught my eye. A man emerged from the shadows near the side of the building. He was tall and gaunt, wearing ratty jeans and a stained t-shirt. His eyes locked onto me with an unsettling intensity. "Hey!" he called out, his voice raspy. "You heading north?" I hesitated, alarm bells going off in my head. Yeah," I replied cautiously. He took a few steps closer. "Listen, I really need a ride. My car broke down a few miles back and I've been stuck here for hours. No one stopped. Please, I'm desperate." Every instinct told me to get back in my car and drive away. But part of me felt bad for the guy. He did look pretty rough. "Sorry, man, I can't. I'm in a hurry to get home," I said, trying to sound firm but non-confrontational. His face darkened. "Come on, I'm begging you. It's just up the road a bit. Won't take long." I shook my head. I really can't. Maybe the clerk inside can call you a tow truck or something." That's when things took a turn. The man's whole demeanor changed in an instant. His eyes flashed with anger, and he took several quick steps towards me. "Listen here, you selfish prick," he snarled. "I'm not asking any more. You're giving me a fucking ride." My heart started racing. I backed up, fumbling for my car keys. "Stay back," I warned, trying to keep my voice steady. "I don't want any trouble." He laughed, a harsh, humorless sound. "Oh, there's gonna be trouble, all right. You think you can just leave me stranded out here? I've been waiting all goddamn night for someone to come along." I glanced towards the store, praying the clerk would come out, but the place looked completely empty. It was just me and this increasingly unhinged stranger. He was getting closer, his hands balled into fists at his sides. "Get in the fucking car," he growled. "You're taking me where I need to go." I turned and sprinted for my car, adrenaline surging through me. I could hear his footsteps pounding behind me. I reached the driver's side door and yanked it open, practically diving inside. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely get the key in the ignition. The man slammed into the side of my car just as I got the engine started. He pounded on the window, his face contorted with rage. "You're not going anywhere!" he screamed. I threw the car into reverse and floored it, tires squealing. The man stumbled back as I peeled away. In my rearview mirror, I saw him running after me, but I didn't slow down. I fishtailed onto the highway, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst out of my chest. For the next hour, I drove like a maniac, constantly checking my mirrors, terrified I'd see headlights gaining on me. Every car I passed made me flinch. My mind raced with horrible scenarios. What if he'd somehow gotten into my car while I wasn't looking? What if he was hiding in the back seat, waiting to attack? I knew I was being irrational, but I couldn't shake the fear. That man's eyes, filled with such anger and desperation, were burned into my memory. I felt like prey that had narrowly escaped a predator. As the sky began to lighten with the first hints of dawn, I finally allowed myself to relax a little. I was miles away from that gas station now, but I knew it would be a long time before I felt truly safe again. I couldn't stop thinking about what might have happened if I hadn't gotten away. The way that man had switched from pleading to threatening so quickly chilled me to the bone. It was like he'd been wearing a mask of normalcy that had suddenly slipped away, revealing something dark and dangerous underneath. When I finally got home, I locked every door and window. I was jumpy for days, startling at every little noise. I kept replaying the encounter in my mind, second-guessing my actions. Should I have tried to help him? Was I overreacting? But deep down, I knew I'd made the right choice. My gut instinct had been screaming danger from the moment I saw him. It's been months now, and I still get anxious when I have to drive long distances, especially at night. I avoid isolated gas stations like the plague. Sometimes when I'm alone in my car, I'll get a prickly feeling on the back of my neck, like someone's watching me. I'll check my rearview mirror, half expecting to see that man's face leering back at me. I know it's unlikely I'll ever see him again, but the memory of that night haunts me. It was a harsh reminder of how quickly a normal situation can turn dangerous, how vulnerable we all are when we're alone on the road. I'm more cautious now, more aware of my surroundings. And I never, ever pick up hitchhikers. Sometimes I wonder what became of that man. Did he ever get wherever he was trying to go? Is he still out there, waiting at lonely gas stations, preying on unsuspecting travelers? The thought sends shivers down my spine. I've tried to rationalize it, to tell myself that maybe he was just desperate and not actually dangerous. But I can't shake the feeling that I narrowly escaped something truly terrible that night. the look in his eyes as he chased after my car. It wasn't just anger or frustration. It was something feral, something hungry. I've never told anyone the full story before. It sounds almost too cinematic to be believed. But I know what I experienced, and the fear I felt was all too real. Even now, as I write this, my palms are sweating and my heart is racing. To anyone reading this, please be careful out there. Trust your instincts. If something feels off, it probably is. Don't let politeness or guilt override your sense of self-preservation. It's better to seem rude than to put yourself in danger. And if you're ever driving late at night and see a tall, gaunt man asking for a ride at a deserted gas station, keep driving. Don't stop. Don't look back. Just get as far away as you can, as fast as you can. You'll be glad you did. It was supposed to be an exciting time for our family. My mom had gone into labor earlier that day, and my parents rushed off to the hospital to welcome my baby sister into the world. I was disappointed I couldn't go with them, but they promised it wouldn't be long. My aunt was supposed to come stay with me, but she got held up at work and said she'd be there in a few hours. So for the first time ever, I was left alone in our house. At first, I was thrilled by the newfound freedom. I ate ice cream for dinner, watched TV shows I wasn't usually allowed to see, and stayed up way past my bedtime. But as night fell and the house grew dark and quiet, an unsettling feeling began to creep over me. Every creak and groan of the old building made me jump. Shadows seemed to move in the corners of my vision. I told myself I was being silly. I was a big kid now, practically a big brother. I shouldn't be scared of the dark. To distract myself, I decided to build a blanket fort in the living room. I was in the middle of arranging pillows when I heard it, the unmistakable sound of the back door handle jiggling. My blood ran cold. It's just Aunt Linda, I tried to reassure myself. But deep down, I knew it wasn't her. She would have called out or used her key. The jiggling grew more insistent, followed by a muffled thud. Then silence. I held my breath, praying it was just my imagination. But a moment later, I heard the creak of the door swinging open, followed by heavy footsteps in the kitchen. Panic exploded in my chest. This was really happening. Someone was breaking into our house. I was frozen in terror, my mind racing. Should I run, hide, call for help? But my body wouldn't move, and I realized with horror that I'd left my parents' cell phone upstairs. The intruder's footsteps were getting closer. In a burst of adrenaline, I scrambled to my feet and bolted for the hall closet. I barely managed to shut the door behind me before I heard them enter the living room. Wedging myself between winter coats, I curled into a tight ball and covered my mouth with both hands to muffle my panicked breathing. "Check upstairs," a gruff male voice said. "I'll take down here. Be quick about it." My heart was pounding so hard I was sure they'd hear it. Tears streamed silently down my face as I listened to them ransacking our home. Drawers slammed, glass shattered. I flinched at every noise, terrified they'd discover my hiding spot at any moment. "Any cash?" The first voice called up the stairs. "Couple hundred in the bedroom," came the reply. "Some jewelry, too. You?" "TV, laptop, bunch of useless knickknacks. Let's get the big stuff to the van." I don't know how long I huddled there in the dark, shaking uncontrollably as they carried our belongings out of the house. It felt like hours. Eventually, I heard the back door close one final time, followed by the rumble of an engine starting up outside. But I was too paralyzed by fear to move. What if they came back? What if there were more of them still inside? My racing mind conjured images of masked men lurking in every shadow, waiting to grab me the moment I emerged. So I stayed put, muscles cramping, barely daring to breathe. I must have dozed off at some point from sheer exhaustion. The next thing I knew, lights were flicking on and frantic voices were calling my name. "Tommy? Tommy, where are you?" It was my dad. Relief flooded through me, but I still couldn't make myself leave the closet. I wanted to call out, but my voice wouldn't work. It wasn't until he yanked open the closet door that I finally broke down, sobbing. "Oh, thank God," he choked out, scooping me into his arms. "It's okay, buddy. You're safe now. We've got you." The next few hours passed in a blur. Police swarmed the house, asking endless questions that I could barely focus on. I just clung to my parents, too shell-shocked to do much besides nod or shake my head. They told me how worried they'd been when my aunt arrived to an empty house with signs of a break-in, how they'd rushed home in a panic, fearing the worst. I learned that my baby sister had been born healthy earlier that evening, but what should have been one of the happiest days of our lives was overshadowed by the trauma of that night. My parents were racked with guilt for leaving me alone, even though I insisted it wasn't their fault. The police never caught the men who robbed us. In the days and weeks that followed, I was a nervous wreck. I couldn't sleep unless every light in the house was on. The slightest unexpected noise would send me into a panic attack. I begged my parents not to leave me alone, even for a few minutes. They took me to a child psychologist, but talking about that night only seemed to make the fears worse. We eventually moved to a new house in a different neighborhood, hoping for a fresh start. My parents installed a top-of-the-line security system and got a big dog, but nowhere ever felt truly safe to me again. That sense of violation, of strangers invading the place that was supposed to be my sanctuary, left deep scars on my psyche. Even now, as a grown man with a family of my own, I struggle with the lasting effects of that night. I'm hyper-vigilant about home security, triple-checking locks and jumping at shadows. I have a hard time trusting strangers. Nightmares about faceless intruders still plague me occasionally. But I'm working on it. Therapy has helped me process a lot of the lingering trauma. I'm determined not to let that experience define me or control my life. It's a daily challenge, but I refuse to let those men steal anything more from me than they already have. I often wonder about the what-ifs. What if I had called for help somehow? What if I had confronted them? But deep down, I know I was just a scared little kid doing the only thing I could to survive. I'm grateful it wasn't worse, that I wasn't hurt or killed that night. But the emotional wounds run deep. To anyone reading this who has experienced something similar, please know that you're not alone. Healing is possible, even if the road is long and difficult. That night may have shaken my sense of safety, but it also showed me how strong and resilient I could be. I survived, and I'm determined to thrive. It was a Friday in October, crisp autumn air seeping through the cracks of our old farmhouse. I had settled in for the evening, sprawled on the couch watching horror movies. The irony isn't lost on me now. Around 11 p.m. I heard a noise from the back deck. At first, I brushed it off as the wind or a raccoon. But then I heard it again, a distinct shuffling sound. My heart started racing as I muted the TV. The house was dead silent except for that shuffling. Slowly, I crept towards the sliding glass door that led to the deck. The porch light was off, leaving only inky darkness beyond the glass. As I reached for the light switch, my hand trembling, a flash of movement caught my eye. I froze, my blood turning to ice. There, illuminated by the pale moonlight, was a man sitting in one of our deck chairs. He was facing away from me, perfectly still. I could only see the back of his head, greasy, matted hair hanging limply. Every instinct screamed at me to run, but I was paralyzed with fear. I don't know how long I stood there, barely breathing, before I found the courage to flick on the porch light. The sudden brightness made me squint, but when my eyes adjusted, the man was gone. Relief flooded through me for a split second before panic set in again. Where did he go? Was he still out there? I frantically scanned the deck, my yard, the tree line. Nothing. With shaking hands, I fumbled for my phone to call 911. As I was dialing, movement in my peripheral vision made me look up. My heart nearly stopped. The man was back, standing right outside the glass door. His face was inches from mine, separated only by the thin pane. In the harsh porch light, I could see every detail of his appearance, and it haunts me to this day. His skin was sallow and waxy, stretched tight over prominent cheekbones. Dark, sunken eyes stared unblinkingly into mine, glassy and vacant. But the worst part was his mouth. It was stretched into an unnaturally wide grin, lips pulled back to reveal yellowed teeth. As I stood there, paralyzed by terror, he slowly raised one hand and pressed it against the glass. His fingers were long and spindly, nails cracked and caked with dirt. Then he started to laugh. It was unlike any laugh I'd ever heard, silent but unmistakable. His shoulders shook, head thrown back, mouth open in that terrible grin. But no sound came out, just this awful silent laughter that seemed to go on forever. I don't remember dropping the phone or screaming, but I must have done both. The next thing I knew, I was huddled in the corner of the living room, sobbing uncontrollably. The 911 operator's voice was tinny and distant from the phone on the floor. When I finally managed to choke out what was happening, they told me to stay put and that officers were on their way. Those next 15 minutes were the longest of my life. I kept my eyes squeezed shut, too terrified to look at the door. But I could feel his presence, that silent laughter echoing in my head. The police arrived with sirens blaring and lights flashing. By the time I worked up the courage to peek out the window, there were 3 squad cars in my driveway. Officers swarmed the property, flashlights sweeping across the yard and woods. They found nothing. No trace of the man, no footprints, nothing disturbed on the deck. One officer gently suggested I might have fallen asleep watching scary movies and had a vivid nightmare. But I knew what I saw. The image of that face pressed against the glass was burned into my mind. They took my statement and did a thorough search of the house and surrounding area. Finding no evidence of an intruder, they chalked it up to an overactive imagination. Before leaving, they gave me a card for a youth counselor and told me to call if I needed anything. I spent the rest of the night huddled in my parents' bed, every light in the house blazing. Sleep was impossible. Every creak of the old house made me flinch. When dawn finally broke, I felt a small measure of relief. Somehow, the terrors of the night seemed less real in the light of day. But that feeling didn't last. In the weeks and months that followed, I was a nervous wreck. I couldn't sleep without a light on. The slightest noise at night would send me into a panic. My parents were worried sick, shuttling me between doctors and therapists trying to help. I was diagnosed with PTSD and put on medication. It helped dull the constant anxiety, but it couldn't erase the memories. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that face, that terrible silent laugh. Even now, years later, I'm not the same person I was before that night. I can't stand to be alone in a house. Darkness terrifies me. I'm constantly looking over my shoulder, always feeling like I'm being watched. The rational part of my brain knows it was probably just some sick prank or a hallucination brought on by too many horror movies. But deep down, in the primal part of my mind that deals in nightmares and monsters, I know what I saw was real. Sometimes late at night when the world is quiet, I swear I can hear it again, that silent, mirthless laughter carried on the wind. And I know, with a certainty that chills me to my core, that he's still out there, waiting, watching. I don't know why he chose me that night, or why he didn't try harder to get inside. Maybe he was just toying with me, enjoying my fear. Maybe he's visited others, leaving them as broken and paranoid as me. All I know is that I'll never feel truly safe again. Every darkened window is a potential portal for that grinning face to appear. Every unexpected noise could be him, coming back to finish whatever game he started that night. I've tried to move on, to convince myself it wasn't real, but then I'll catch a glimpse of someone on the street with that same wide, unnatural grin. Or I'll wake up in the middle of the night, certain I heard that silent laugh just outside my window. And I know deep in my bones that he's still out there, still watching, still waiting for the perfect moment to return and claim whatever it is he wants from me. So I keep the lights on. I double-check the locks. I never sit with my back to a window, because I know that one day when I least expect it, I'll turn around and see that face pressed against the glass once more. And this time, a locked door might not be enough to keep him out. I never thought a simple piece of furniture could turn my life upside down, but that's exactly what happened last summer. It all started when my wife and I decided to clean out the basement of our new house. We had just moved in a few weeks prior and hadn't gotten around to sorting through all the junk the previous owners had left behind. As we were hauling boxes up the stairs, I noticed an old wooden rocking chair tucked away in a dark corner. It looked antique, with intricate carvings along the arms and back. Something about it caught my eye, so I decided to bring it upstairs to take a closer look. "Hey, honey, check this out," I called to my wife as I set the chair down in our living room. "Pretty cool, huh? Maybe we can restore it." She glanced over and shrugged. "It's kind of creepy looking if you ask me, but do whatever you want with it." I spent the rest of the afternoon cleaning up the chair, polishing the wood, and tightening some loose joints. By evening, it was looking much better. I placed it near the fireplace, feeling quite pleased with my handiwork. That night, I woke up around 3 a.m. to use the bathroom. As I passed by the living room, I froze in my tracks. The rocking chair was moving back and forth on its own, creaking softly in the darkness. My heart started racing as I fumbled for the light switch. When the room illuminated, the chair was perfectly still. I chalked it up to my sleepy imagination and went back to bed. But over the next few days, strange things kept happening. Objects would randomly fall off shelves when no one was near them. Doors would slam shut on their own. The temperature in the house would suddenly drop for no reason, leaving us shivering. My wife insisted it was just an old house settling, but I had a gut feeling it was connected to that chair somehow. I started avoiding the living room altogether, taking detours through other parts of the house so I wouldn't have to look at it. About a week after bringing the chair upstairs, things escalated dramatically. I was home alone one afternoon when I heard a loud crash from the kitchen. I ran in to find every single cabinet flung open, with dishes and glasses shattered all over the floor. As I stood there in shock, I heard the unmistakable sound of the rocking chair creaking behind me. I spun around to see it rocking violently back and forth, much faster than should be physically possible. A bone-chilling scream echoed through the house. It took me a moment to realize it was coming from my own throat. I bolted out the front door and didn't stop running until I reached the end of our street. With shaking hands, I called my wife and begged her to come home from work early. When she arrived, I told her everything that had happened. She was skeptical at first, but agreed to help me get rid of the chair right away. We cautiously re-entered the house. Everything was eerily quiet and still. The chair sat motionless by the fireplace, looking completely ordinary. But as soon as we approached it, a deafening roar filled the room. It sounded like a mixture of howling wind and inhuman screaming. The chair began to shake and vibrate intensely. Books flew off shelves, picture frames crashed to the floor, and the lights flickered on and off. My wife screamed and ran outside. I tried to follow, but found myself frozen in place, unable to move or even speak. The chair slowly rose into the air, hovering about 3 feet off the ground. It rotated to face me directly. In that moment, I swear I saw a face materialize in the wood grain, twisted and malevolent, with glowing red eyes. A deep voice boomed inside my head, "This is my home now!" I don't remember what happened next. My wife told me later that she found me unconscious on the living room floor. When I came to, the chair was gone without a trace. We tore the house apart looking for it, but it had completely vanished. In the days that followed, the paranormal activity ceased entirely. It was as if whatever sinister force had been terrorizing us simply disappeared along with that chair. We debated calling the police, but what would we even tell them? That we were attacked by a possessed antique? We decided to try to move on and forget the whole ordeal, but I still have nightmares about that day. I wake up in a cold sweat, the phantom sound of creaking wood echoing in my ears. Sometimes I catch glimpses of movement out of the corner of my eye, only to turn and find nothing there. My wife thinks I'm paranoid, but I'm convinced that chair is still out there somewhere. And I can't shake the feeling that one day it's going to find its way back to me. Every time I see a rocking chair now, my blood runs cold. I don't know if I'll ever feel truly safe again. I'm sharing this story as a warning to others. If you come across an old piece of furniture that gives you a bad feeling, trust your instincts. Some things are better left undisturbed in dark basements. You never know what kind of malevolent energy might be attached to seemingly innocent objects. I often wonder about the previous owners of our house. Did they experience similar phenomena? Is that why they left the chair behind when they moved out? I've thought about trying to track them down to ask, but part of me is terrified of what I might learn. These days, I find myself constantly on edge. Every creak of the floorboards makes me flinch. I avoid antique stores and flea markets like the plague. I've even gotten rid of most of the wooden furniture in our house, replacing it with modern metal and plastic pieces. My wife thinks I'm overreacting, but she didn't see what I saw that day. She didn't feel the overwhelming sense of evil emanating from that chair. Sometimes I catch her giving me worried looks when she thinks I'm not paying attention. I know she's concerned about my mental state, but I can't help it. The fear has burrowed deep inside me and refuses to let go. I've tried talking to a therapist about what happened, but I always chicken out at the last minute. How can I possibly explain something so utterly beyond the realm of normal human experience? I'm afraid they'll think I'm delusional and try to have me committed. So I keep it all bottled up inside, putting on a brave face for the world, while internally I'm constantly on high alert. Every time I enter a new room, my eyes automatically scan for any signs of that damn chair. I know it's irrational, but I can't help it. Sometimes I wonder if I'm going crazy. Maybe it was all just a vivid hallucination brought on by stress or lack of sleep. But then I remember the pure terror I felt in that moment, the kind of primal fear that reaches down into your very soul. That's not something you can simply imagine. I've done some research into paranormal phenomena since then, trying to make sense of what happened to us. I've read countless stories of haunted objects and malevolent spirits attaching themselves to antiques. It's somewhat comforting to know we're not alone in our experience, but it also terrifies me to think about how many other dangerous artifacts might be out there. I've become obsessed with the history of our house, poring over old records and newspaper articles. So far, I haven't found anything to explain the chair's presence or its apparent supernatural powers. But I won't give up. I need answers, even if they lead me down a dark path. For now, all I can do is stay vigilant and hope that whatever force was contained in that chair has truly moved on. But deep down, I know the truth. This isn't over. Somewhere out there, in someone else's home, that rocking chair is waiting, watching, biding its time until it can wreak havoc once again. So please take my story as a cautionary tale. Be careful what you bring into your home. Some things are better left forgotten in the shadows. And if you ever come across an old wooden rocking chair with intricate carvings, for the love of all that is holy, leave it where you found it. Your sanity may depend on it. The day I moved in, I noticed something odd. There was a faint thumping sound coming from somewhere upstairs. I figured it was just the house settling or maybe some pipes, so I ignored it. But as the day went on, the sound got louder and more frequent. It was starting to freak me out a little. I decided to investigate. I went upstairs and followed the sound to a door at the end of the hallway. It led to the attic. The thumping was definitely coming from up there. My heart was racing as I reached for the doorknob. Part of me wanted to just ignore it and go back downstairs, but curiosity got the better of me. The door creaked open, and I peered into the darkness. The attic was full of old junk left behind by the previous owners. Boxes, furniture, and who knows what else. I fumbled for the light switch and flicked it on. The bare bulb flickered to life, casting eerie shadows across the room. That's when I saw her. In the far corner of the attic, there was a woman. She was facing the wall, her back to me. She had long, matted black hair and was wearing a tattered white nightgown. My blood ran cold. I wanted to run, but I was frozen in place. "Hello?" I managed to choke out. No response. She didn't move a muscle. I took a step closer, my legs shaking. "Excuse me, are you okay?" Still nothing. I was about 10 feet away from her now. I could hear my heart pounding in my ears. I reached out to tap her on the shoulder. Just as my hand was about to make contact, she spun around. I stumbled backward, nearly falling down the attic stairs. Her face. God, her face. It was pale and gaunt, with sunken eyes that seemed to stare right through me. Her mouth was open in a silent scream. I bolted down the stairs, slamming the attic door behind me. I ran out of the house and didn't stop until I was halfway down the street. I stood there, gasping for air, trying to process what I'd just seen. After a few minutes, I managed to calm down a bit. I told myself I was just seeing things. It was an old house, after all. Maybe it was just a trick of the light or my imagination running wild. I took a deep breath and decided to go back inside. I needed to face this head on. As I approached the house, I noticed something strange. All the windows were dark. I was sure I'd left some lights on when I ran out. I unlocked the front door and stepped inside, flicking on the lights as I went. Everything seemed normal. No sounds, no movement. I made my way upstairs, my heart racing with each step. I approached the attic door, my hand trembling as I reached for the knob. I took a deep breath and opened it. The attic was empty. No woman, no thumping, nothing out of the ordinary. Just the same old junk I'd seen earlier. I let out a sigh of relief. Maybe I really had imagined the whole thing. I spent the rest of the day unpacking and trying to settle in. As night fell, I started to feel a bit more at ease. I made myself dinner and sat down to watch some TV, trying to put the bizarre experience out of my mind. Around midnight, I decided to head to bed. As I was brushing my teeth, I heard it again. The thumping. It was coming from upstairs. My heart sank. I tried to convince myself it was just the house settling, but deep down, I knew better. I couldn't ignore it. I had to know what was going on. I crept up the stairs, my phone in hand as a makeshift flashlight. The thumping got louder as I approached the attic door. I stood there for what felt like hours, trying to work up the courage to open it. Finally, I grabbed the doorknob and flung the door open. The attic was pitch black. I shone my phone light around the room, my hand shaking so badly I could barely hold it steady. And there she was again, in the same corner, facing the wall. "Who are you?" I shouted, my voice cracking. "What do you want?" Slowly, she turned around. Her face was different this time. It was melting, like candle wax dripping down her cheeks. Her eyes were completely black, and her mouth was stretched into an impossibly wide grin. I screamed and slammed the door shut. I ran to my bedroom and locked myself in, pushing a dresser in front of the door for good measure. I sat on my bed, shaking uncontrollably, listening for any sound of movement. The house was silent. Too silent. I didn't sleep a wink that night. As soon as the sun came up, I packed a bag and left. I couldn't stay in that house another minute. I called a realtor that day and put the house up for sale. I told them I was moving for work, not daring to mention what I'd seen. I stayed with a friend while the house was on the market, refusing to step foot in it again. Months went by, and the house wouldn't sell. Every potential buyer would back out at the last minute, always with some vague excuse. I was starting to think I'd be stuck with the place forever. Then, out of the blue, I got a call from the realtor. An older couple had made an offer, sight unseen. They wanted to close immediately. I didn't ask questions. I signed the papers as quickly as I could, relieved to finally be rid of the place. A few weeks after the sale, curiosity got the better of me. I drove by the house just to see if the new owners had moved in. What I saw made my blood run cold. The house was abandoned, overgrown with weeds, windows boarded up. It looked like it had been that way for years, but that was impossible. I'd just sold it a month ago. I asked around the neighborhood. Nobody knew anything about a sale. According to them, the house had been empty for decades. There were rumors about it being haunted, about people going missing after spending the night there. I tried to find records of the sale, of my time living there, anything. But it was like it had all been erased, like those months of my life never happened. To this day, I can't explain what happened in that house. Sometimes I wonder if I imagined the whole thing. But then I remember her face, that melting, grinning face, and I know it was real. I've never gone back to that neighborhood. I can't bring myself to see if the house is still there. Part of me hopes it's gone, demolished and forgotten, but another part of me knows better. I have a feeling that house, and whatever lives in its attic will be there long after I'm gone. I still hear the thumping sometimes in my dreams, and on quiet nights when the wind is just right, I swear I can hear a woman's laughter echoing from somewhere far away. It makes me wonder, did I ever really escape that house? Or is some part of me still there, trapped in that attic with her? I don't know if I'll ever have answers. All I know is that I'll never forget what happened in that house, and I'll never, ever go into another attic as long as I live. I never believed in ghosts or the supernatural. That all changed last summer when I decided to rent an old Victorian house for a few months while working on my novel. The place was a steal, suspiciously cheap for such a grand old home, but I was too excited about having a quiet place to write to question it much. The first few weeks were uneventful. I settled into a routine of writing during the day and relaxing in the evenings. The house had a certain charm, with its ornate woodwork and antique fixtures. But there was also an underlying eeriness I couldn't quite put my finger on. It started with little things, items not being where I left them, cold drafts in rooms with closed windows, the floorboards creaking at night as if someone was walking around. I chalked it up to an old house settling and my imagination running wild from too much time alone. But then things escalated. One night I woke up to all the faucets in the house running full blast. I definitely hadn't left them on. Another time, I came home to find all the furniture in the living room rearranged. When I tried to move it back, it felt impossibly heavy, like it was bolted to the floor. The incidents kept getting stranger and more frequent. Shadows darting just out of sight, whispering voices when I was alone in the house. My manuscript pages scattered across the floor, covered in symbols I didn't recognize. I started to dread being in the house, but I had already paid for the whole summer, and part of me was morbidly curious to see how far things would go. I set up cameras, but they would always mysteriously shut off right before anything happened. The breaking point came about 6 weeks in. I woke up in the middle of the night to a bone-chilling scream. Heart pounding, I grabbed my phone to call the police, but the line was dead. When I tried to leave my bedroom, the door was locked from the outside. Panic rising, I went to the window. What I saw made my blood run cold. There was a ghostly figure floating in the yard, illuminated by an otherworldly glow. It slowly turned and looked right at me with hollow black eyes. I stumbled backward, falling onto the bed. When I looked again, it was gone. But now I could hear heavy footsteps coming up the stairs. My door handle started to turn, even though it had been locked. I squeezed my eyes shut, paralyzed with fear. The door creaked open. I felt an icy presence enter the room, the air thick with malevolence. Then a raspy voice whispered right in my ear, "Get out!" I bolted upright, heart racing. Sunlight was streaming through the window. Had it all been a nightmare? I wasn't sure, but I wasn't taking any chances. I threw some clothes in a bag and got the hell out of there, leaving most of my stuff behind. I called the property manager later to explain why I had left. To my shock, he had no idea what I was talking about. He insisted the house had been empty all summer and no one had rented it. When I described the Victorian, he said there was no such house on their property listings. I drove back to double-check, thinking maybe I had the wrong address. But where the house had stood was just an empty, overgrown lot. There was no sign a building had ever been there. To this day, I have no explanation for what happened. Was it all an elaborate hallucination? Some kind of shared delusion with the property manager? Or something truly supernatural? I still get chills thinking about it. I've tried to put it behind me, But sometimes at night I still hear that raspy whisper, "Get out." And I wonder, what if I had stayed? What other horrors awaited in that impossible house? I'm just grateful I escaped when I did, even if I'll never understand what really happened there. The experience shook me to my core and made me question everything I thought I knew about reality. I used to be a skeptic, but now I'm not so sure. There are things in this world that defy explanation, dark, ancient things that are better left alone. I still write, but I stick to non-fiction now, and I always make sure to thoroughly research any place I'm staying, no matter how good the deal seems. You never know what secrets an old house might be hiding, or what might be waiting in the shadows. Sometimes I wonder if I imagined the whole thing. But then I'll come across one of the photos I managed to save from that summer. And there in the background, just barely visible, is a dark figure with glowing eyes, watching, waiting. I don't know if I'll ever fully recover from what happened in that house. The fear and uncertainty have become a part of me. I find myself jumping at shadows and lying awake at night, straining to hear phantom footsteps. I've tried therapy, meditation, even hypnosis to try to make sense of it all. But nothing has been able to fully erase the memories or explain what I experienced. Part of me wants desperately to understand, to find some logical explanation that would let me sleep soundly again. But another part of me is terrified of digging any deeper. What if there really are malevolent forces out there, just waiting for an invitation to cross over into our world? What if my experience was just the tip of the iceberg, a brief glimpse into horrors beyond human comprehension? I've read countless books on the paranormal since that summer, desperate for answers. I've even reached out to other people who claim to have had similar experiences. But nothing quite matches what I went through in that house. The worst part is the lingering doubt. Did it really happen? Or am I slowly losing my grip on reality? Sometimes I wonder if I'm still in that house, trapped in some kind of nightmare loop, never truly having escaped. All I know for sure is that I'll never rent an old house again, and I always sleep with the lights on now, afraid of what might be lurking in the dark corners of my room. The experience has left me forever changed, forever questioning what's real and what's not. I share my story as a warning to others. Be careful what you invite into your life. Some doors, once opened, can never truly be closed again, and some mysteries are better left unsolved. As I write this, I can't shake the feeling that I'm being watched, that somehow sharing my story has drawn the attention of whatever was in that house. I tell myself it's just paranoia, but deep down I'm not so sure. If you're reading this and have experienced something similar, know that you're not alone. But also know that some things are better left in the past. Some horrors are too great for the human mind to fully comprehend. I don't know what the future holds, or if I'll ever truly feel safe again. But I do know that I'll never forget what happened in that house. The terror, the uncertainty, the feeling of being trapped in a nightmare I couldn't wake up from. So be careful out there. And if you ever find yourself in a situation that doesn't feel right, trust your instincts. Get out before it's too late, before you become another ghost story, another unexplained mystery. As for me, I'll keep searching for answers, but I'll do it from the safety of my well-lit apartment, far away from any old Victorian houses or too-good-to-be-true rental deals. Some risks just aren't worth taking, no matter how tempting they might seem. Stay safe out there, and remember, not all houses are homes. Some are hungry, waiting to devour the unwary. Don't become their next meal. It was a cold, rainy night in October when everything went to hell. I arrived for my shift at 10 p.m. as usual. The asylum loomed before me, a massive Victorian-era building with boarded-up windows and crumbling brickwork. As I walked up to the entrance, I felt an odd sense of unease, like something was watching me from the shadows. I unlocked the heavy front doors and stepped inside, flicking on my flashlight. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating peeling wallpaper and debris-strewn hallways. I did my usual rounds, checking each floor to make sure no one had broken in. Everything seemed normal at first, just the usual creaks and groans of the old building settling. Around midnight, I was sitting in the security office near the entrance when I heard it, a child's laughter echoing from somewhere deep in the asylum. I froze, my blood running cold. There shouldn't be anyone else in the building, let alone a child. I grabbed my flashlight and radio, heart pounding as I went to investigate. The laughter seemed to be coming from the east wing on the third floor. As I climbed the stairs, the sound grew louder, punctuated by the patter of small feet running down the hallway. "Hello," I called out, my voice shaky. "Is someone there? This is security. You're not supposed to be in here." No response, just more giggling that seemed to be moving further away. I followed the sound, my flashlight beam bouncing off grimy walls covered in decades of graffiti. The third floor was where they used to keep the most dangerous patients back when this place was operational. There were padded cells, restraint chairs, all kinds of disturbing reminders of the asylum's dark past. As I turned a corner, I caught a glimpse of something small darting into one of the rooms. "Hey!" I shouted, running after it. I burst into the room, but it was empty, just a bare concrete cell with a tiny barred window. The laughter now seemed to be coming from the room next door. This went on for what felt like hours, chasing the phantom child from room to room. Every time I thought I had it cornered, it would somehow slip away, always staying just out of sight. I was getting more panicked by the minute. This couldn't be real. I must be going crazy. Eventually, I found myself in the old electroshock therapy room. Ancient equipment lay scattered about, coated in cobwebs. My flashlight beam landed on a small figure huddled in the corner. I approached slowly, heart in my throat. "It's okay," I said softly. "I'm not going to hurt you. Let's get you out of here." The figure turned and I let out a strangled gasp. It wasn't a child at all, but some kind of twisted, emaciated creature. Its skin was gray and mottled, stretched taut over an inhuman skull. Black eyes like bottomless pits stared into mine. A wide mouth split open in a horrific grin, revealing rows of needle-sharp teeth. I screamed and stumbled backward, dropping my flashlight. The creature let out that same childlike giggle I'd been hearing all night. Only now it was distorted and wrong. It skittered towards me with impossible speed on all fours. I turned and ran blindly down the dark hallway, the sound of scraping claws right behind me. I flew down the stairs, taking them 3 at a time and nearly falling several times. The giggling had turned into a high-pitched shriek that seemed to be coming from all directions. I burst out of the front doors into the rainy night, not stopping until I reached my car. I fumbled with the keys, hands shaking violently. Just as I got the door open, I made the mistake of looking back. The creature was perched on the asylum roof, silhouetted against the full moon. It raised one spindly arm and waved at me, that horrific grin still plastered across its face. Then it melted into the shadows, leaving me to question my own sanity. I peeled out of there as fast as I could, tires squealing on the wet pavement. I drove straight home, locked all the doors and windows, and huddled in bed with the lights on until dawn. I called in sick the next day and never went back to that job. I told my boss I quit, making up some excuse about a family emergency. For weeks afterward, I barely slept. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that thing's face grinning at me. I jumped at every sound, convinced it had followed me home somehow. I started drinking heavily just to be able to pass out at night. Eventually, the panic subsided, and I was able to convince myself it had all been some kind of stress-induced hallucination. I mean, it had to be, right? There's no such thing as monsters. I got a new job, stopped drinking, and tried to move on with my life. But I still avoid that part of town like the plague. Just seeing the asylum in the distance is enough to bring it all flooding back. I've never told anyone this story before. They'd think I was crazy. Hell, maybe I am crazy. But I know what I saw that night. Sometimes I still hear that giggle in my dreams, and I wake up in a cold sweat, wondering if it's out there somewhere, waiting. I don't know if it was a ghost, a demon, or something else entirely. All I know is that there are things in this world that defy explanation, things that lurk in the darkness just beyond our understanding. And once you've seen them, you can never truly feel safe again. I'm sorry if this story seems disjointed or hard to follow. It's difficult to put into words the sheer terror of that night. Even now, years later, my hands are shaking as I type this. I guess I'm hoping that by sharing it, maybe I can finally start to let it go. But a part of me wonders, what if it's still out there? What if by telling this story, I've somehow drawn its attention again? God, I hope not. Because if I ever see that thing again, I don't think I'll be able to run away this time. The fear would probably stop my heart on the spot. So if you're reading this and you live anywhere near that old asylum, my advice is to stay far, far away. Some places are abandoned for a reason, and some things are better left undisturbed in the dark. I've tried to rationalize it over the years. Maybe it was just an escaped mental patient, deformed and dangerous. Maybe I breathed in some kind of hallucinogenic mold spores in that old building. Hell, maybe I had a psychotic break brought on by the stress and isolation of the job. But deep down, I know the truth. What I encountered that night was something beyond human understanding, something ancient and evil that should not exist in our world. I still have nightmares about those eyes, those teeth. Sometimes I wake up convinced I can hear that giggle coming from just outside my bedroom door. On really bad nights, I swear I can feel its presence in the room with me, watching me from the shadows. I've been to therapists, but I can never bring myself to tell them the whole story. They'd probably have me committed. So I live with it, this constant undercurrent of fear and doubt. I avoid dark places. I sleep with a nightlight. I've become almost obsessively security conscious, installing cameras and alarms all over my house. But no matter what I do, I can't shake the feeling that someday, somehow, I'll turn a corner and see that twisted grin waiting for me again. If you're reading this and you've had a similar experience, know that you're not alone. And if you haven't, count yourself lucky. Because once you've glimpsed what's lurking just beyond the veil of our reality, you can never truly go back to a normal life. The best you can hope for is to learn to live with the fear, to push it down deep inside, and pray it never finds its way out again. So that's my story. Believe it or don't, it makes no difference to me. I know what I saw, what I experienced, and I know that I'll carry the scars of that night with me for the rest of my life. If nothing else, maybe this can serve as a warning to others. Some places should remain abandoned, some doors should stay closed, and some things are better left alone in the dark. I had just moved into an old Victorian house in a small town. It was a beautiful place with intricate woodwork and stained glass windows, but it needed some serious updating. I got a great deal on it and was excited to fix it up. The first few weeks were uneventful as I worked on painting and repairs. One night, I woke up suddenly around 3 a.m. At first I wasn't sure why, but then I heard it, footsteps coming from upstairs, which was strange because I was on the top floor. My heart started racing as I listened to the slow, deliberate steps moving across the ceiling above me. I tried to convince myself it was just the house settling, or maybe a raccoon in the attic, but it sounded so distinctly like a person walking. After a few minutes, the footsteps stopped. I eventually fell back into an uneasy sleep. The next morning, I went up to check out the attic, but when I got to the top of the stairs, I was shocked to find there was no attic access, just a small closet and the peaked roof. There was nowhere the footsteps could have come from. I tried to brush it off, but over the next few days, more strange things started happening. Objects would move on their own when I wasn't looking. I'd come back to a room to find a book or vase in a totally different spot. Once, I watched in disbelief as a cabinet door slowly swung open by itself. The footsteps continued most nights. Sometimes they'd wake me up. Other times I'd hear them as I was trying to fall asleep, always from that non-existent space above my bedroom. About a week after it all started, I was in the kitchen making dinner when I heard a loud crash from upstairs. I ran up to investigate and found a mirror had fallen off the wall and shattered. As I was cleaning up the glass, I noticed something in one of the shards, a reflection of a room I'd never seen before. It was only visible for a split second before the angle changed, but I saw ornate Victorian furniture and wallpaper that didn't match any room in my house. I frantically checked the other pieces but couldn't see it again. That night, the footsteps were louder than ever. They paced back and forth for hours, keeping me wide awake. Around 2 a.m., I'd had enough. I got up and marched to the top of the stairs, determined to prove to myself nothing was there. As I reached the landing, the temperature dropped dramatically. My breath came out in visible puffs. The footsteps suddenly stopped. Then I heard a door creak open behind me. I spun around and my blood ran cold. Where there had always been a blank wall, there was now an ornate wooden door standing open. Beyond it, I could see the same Victorian room from the mirror shard. I stood frozen in shock and terror. A figure began to emerge from the shadows of the room, a woman in an old-fashioned dress with long dark hair obscuring her face. She took a step towards me, and I bolted down the stairs in panic. I ran out of the house and spent the rest of the night in my car. When I worked up the courage to go back inside the next morning, the door and room were gone without a trace. I was seriously freaked out and considered just selling the place and moving. But a mix of curiosity and stubbornness made me want to get to the bottom of it. I started researching the history of the house. It turned out it had been built in the 1890s by a wealthy family. The daughter of the house, Elizabeth, had disappeared mysteriously in 1901. She was never found, and the family moved away soon after. The house changed hands many times over the years, with multiple owners reporting strange occurrences. I became obsessed with trying to make contact with Elizabeth's ghost and figure out what happened to her. I set up cameras and voice recorders all over the house. I even brought in a medium, but she just gave vague, useless readings. Nothing substantial happened for weeks. The footsteps and moving objects continued, but no more phantom doors. I was starting to think I had imagined it all. Then one night, I woke up to find myself not in my bed, but standing in front of that same door at the top of the stairs. It was open again, revealing the Victorian bedroom. My heart pounding, I forced myself to step inside. The door slammed shut behind me. The room was freezing cold, and I could see my breath. It looked just like it would have in 1901. A four-poster bed with lace curtains, a vanity with an ornate mirror, gas lights on the walls. I heard a whisper behind me, "You shouldn't be here." I whirled around to see Elizabeth standing there. Her face was gaunt and pale, her eyes sunken and haunted. She flickered like a struggling flame, fading in and out. "What happened to you?" I managed to ask. "I can never leave," she said, her voice full of sorrow. "I'm trapped here outside of time. This room exists between worlds." She went on to explain that she had discovered the door to this in-between place purely by accident. Fascinated, she had explored it night after night. But one night she stayed too long and found she couldn't return to the real world. She had been stuck here ever since, watching the house change around her, but unable to fully manifest or move on. "You need to go," she said urgently. "If you stay too long, you'll be trapped too. The door won't open for you again." I turned to leave, but the door was gone. Panic rose in my throat as I spun around, searching for an exit. The room started to fade and blur around me. I felt lightheaded, like I was being pulled away from reality. Elizabeth grabbed my arm. "Focus!" she shouted. "Picture your room, your bed. You have to will yourself back." I closed my eyes and concentrated with everything I had on my bedroom. I could feel myself drifting, losing substance. With a final push of mental effort, I imagined myself lying in my bed. I jolted awake with a gasp. I was back in my room, drenched in sweat. Sunlight was streaming through the windows. Had it all been a dream? But there on my arm were bruises in the shape of finger marks where Elizabeth had grabbed me. That was 3 months ago. I haven't seen the door or Elizabeth since that night, but I still hear the footsteps sometimes. Objects still move when I'm not looking. I've learned to live with it. I've tried to find a way to help Elizabeth move on, but I'm afraid to risk entering that room again. I don't know if I'd be able to come back a second time. So I stay in this house with its impossible extra room that only sometimes exists. I tell myself I'm trying to solve the mystery, to help Elizabeth. But the truth is, I'm afraid to leave. Afraid that if I walk away, I'll be abandoning her to an eternity of loneliness. And maybe, deep down, I'm afraid that I've already stayed too long, that some part of me is already trapped there with her, outside of time. I find myself losing track of days, feeling disconnected from the world around me. Sometimes I wonder if I'm still in that room, if all of this is just a fantasy my mind has created. I reach out to touch things, half expecting my hand to pass right through. I don't know how much longer I can stay here, but I also don't know if I can ever truly leave. This house and Elizabeth have become a part of me now, a part I'm not sure I can live without. So I remain in this limbo, caught between two worlds, listening for footsteps in a room that doesn't exist, and wondering if one day I'll find myself unable to return from it. If you're reading this, maybe you can understand why I had to share my story, why I needed someone else to know what happened here. Because sometimes late at night, I look in the mirror, and for just a second, I see that Victorian room reflected back at me, and I'm no longer sure which side of the glass I'm really on. I never thought a simple chair could be so terrifying. But after what happened last month, I can't look at furniture the same way again. It all started when I moved into my new house. It was an old Victorian-style home built in the 1890s. I got it for a steal because it needed a lot of work, but I was excited for the project. The first few weeks were spent cleaning, painting, and fixing up the main living areas. Finally, I decided it was time to tackle the basement. It was dark and musty down there, with bare concrete floors and exposed pipes along the ceiling. As I swept away cobwebs and cleared out junk left by the previous owners, I noticed something in the far corner, an old wooden rocking chair. It seemed out of place among the clutter and grime. The wood was a rich mahogany color, ornately carved with intricate designs. Despite years of dust, it still had a polished sheen. I ran my hand along the smooth armrest, admiring the craftsmanship. This is too nice to leave down here, I thought. I decided to bring it upstairs and make it the centerpiece of my living room. As I gripped the chair to lift it, a chill ran down my spine. I brushed it off as just a draft in the dank basement. I positioned the rocker near the fireplace and stood back to admire it. It really tied the room together nicely. That night, as I relaxed on the couch watching TV, I kept glancing at the chair out of the corner of my eye. I could have sworn I saw it move slightly, like someone had just gotten up from it. But when I looked directly at it, it was perfectly still. Over the next few days, strange things started happening. I'd come home from work to find the chair in a slightly different position than I'd left it. At first, I thought maybe I was just misremembering where I'd placed it. But then other objects in the room started moving too. Picture frames tilted, books rearranged on shelves. One night I woke up to creaking sounds coming from downstairs. As I lay frozen in bed, my heart pounding, I heard the distinct sound of the rocker slowly creaking back and forth. Creak, creak, creak. I was terrified, but eventually fell into a fitful sleep. The next morning, I sprinted downstairs, half expecting to see the chair violently rocking or hovering in midair. But it sat perfectly still, looking innocuous in the early morning light. I started to wonder if I was losing my mind. I decided to set up a camera to see if I could catch any movement. For several nights, nothing happened. But on the fourth night, the footage made my blood run cold. Around 3 a.m., the chair started to rock on its own, slowly at first, then faster and more violently. Suddenly it slid across the floor, slamming into the opposite wall. Then just as quickly, it slid back into its original position. I was officially freaked out. I called a friend to come stay with me, thinking maybe I just needed some company to calm my nerves. We spent the evening chatting and watching movies, pointedly ignoring the chair. Around midnight, we headed to bed. I was awoken a few hours later by my friend's blood-curdling scream. I raced to the guest room to find her pressed against the wall, wide-eyed with terror. "The chair," she gasped. "It was in here, right next to the bed. I woke up and it was looming over me. Then it slid out of the room." Sure enough, when we went downstairs, the rocking chair was back in its usual spot by the fireplace. But there were deep scratch marks on the hardwood floor, leading from the stairs to its current position. That was enough for me. The next day, I lugged that demonic chair back down to the basement and shoved it into the furthest, darkest corner. I piled boxes and other junk in front of it, hoping to contain whatever malevolent force was attached to it. For a blissful week, the house was quiet. No more moving objects, no creaking in the night. I started to relax, thinking maybe it was over. But then the nightmares started. Every night I'd dream of that chair. Sometimes it was chasing me through an endless maze of hallways. Other times, I was tied to it as it rocked faster and faster until I thought I'd be flung into space. The worst was when I dreamed I was the chair. My limbs twisted into gnarled wood, my mind trapped in an inanimate object for eternity. I'd wake up in a cold sweat, sheets tangled around me. Even though I knew the chair was locked away in the basement, I couldn't shake the feeling that it was somehow watching me, waiting. The final straw came about a month after I'd first brought the chair upstairs. I came home from work to find my front door wide open. Fearing a break-in, I cautiously entered the house. Everything seemed normal at first until I saw it. Wet chair prints leading from the basement stairs, through the living room, and out the front door. I ran outside, following the trail of water down my front walk and into the street. The prints continued down the road for about a block before disappearing. I stood there in shock, trying to process what I was seeing. How could a chair be walking around on its own? And where did it go? I spent hours driving around the neighborhood, irrationally searching for a runaway rocking chair. As night fell, I reluctantly returned home. I didn't sleep at all that night, jumping at every creak and groan of the old house settling. The next day, I put the house on the market. I couldn't live there anymore, not knowing when or if that chair might return. As I packed up my belongings, I kept replaying everything in my mind, trying to make sense of it. Was the chair actually haunted, or was I just going crazy? I still don't have answers. Sometimes I wonder if I imagined the whole thing. But then I'll see a rocking chair in a store window or someone's porch, and that familiar chill runs down my spine. I'm writing this from my new apartment across town. It's small, but blessedly free of antique furniture. Still, some nights I lie awake, straining to hear the faint creak of wood in the distance. And I wonder, where is that chair now? What poor soul has taken it into their home, oblivious to the terror that awaits them? All I know is that I'll never look at a rocking chair the same way again. If you come across an ornate mahogany rocker in an old basement or antique shop, my advice is to leave it where it is. Some things are better left undisturbed. The house had always given me the creeps as a kid, but I chalked it up to childish imagination. As I pulled up the long gravel driveway that Friday afternoon, those old feelings came rushing back. The weathered Victorian loomed before me, paint peeling and shutters hanging crooked. I took a deep breath and reminded myself I was just here to pack things up and get it ready to sell. The key stuck in the rusty lock, but finally the front door creaked open. Musty air and the smell of mothballs washed over me as I stepped inside. Everything was just as I remembered. The faded floral wallpaper, the antique furniture draped in dusty sheets. I got to work, starting in the living room. As I sorted through old photo albums and knickknacks, the floorboards above me creaked. I froze, heart pounding. It was probably just the old house settling, I told myself. But then I heard it again, distinct footsteps moving across the ceiling. My hands shaking, I called out, "Hello? Is someone there?" Silence. Maybe it was just my imagination playing tricks on me. I tried to focus on the task at hand, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. As the afternoon wore on, more unexplained noises kept putting me on edge. Doors slamming shut on their own, the sound of glass breaking with nothing broken to be found. At one point I could have sworn I heard a woman's voice whispering, but when I whirled around, the room was empty. By evening, my nerves were totally shot. I decided to call it a day and head up to the guest room to get some sleep. But as I climbed the creaky stairs, that's when I saw her. A woman in an old-fashioned white nightgown standing at the top of the stairs. She stared at me with pitch-black eyes, then vanished in the blink of an eye. I nearly fell backwards down the stairs in shock, This couldn't be happening. Ghosts weren't real. I must be seeing things from lack of sleep. Hands trembling, I continued up to the second floor and shut myself in the guest room, double-checking that the door was locked. Sleep didn't come easy that night. Every creak and groan of the old house had me sitting bolt upright in bed. Around 3 a.m., I jolted awake to the sound of footsteps in the hallway. They stopped right outside my door. The doorknob slowly turned, but the lock held. Then came 3 loud knocks that shook the entire door in its frame. "Who's there?" I called out, my voice cracking. No response, just more knocking, growing more and more frantic. I cowered under the blankets, squeezing my eyes shut and praying for it to stop. When I opened my eyes again, weak morning sunlight was streaming through the window. Had it all been a nightmare? I cautiously opened the door and peered out into the empty hallway. Everything seemed normal in the light of day. I decided to get an early start on packing up the attic, hoping to finish up and get out of there as soon as possible. The rickety stairs to the attic protested under my weight as I climbed up, arms full of empty boxes. The musty attic was crammed full of old furniture and dusty trunks. As I made my way deeper into the clutter, something caught my eye. A faded portrait propped against a stack of boxes. I picked it up, wiping away the grime. My blood ran cold. It was her, the woman I'd seen on the stairs. The portrait was clearly very old, from the late 1800s based on her clothing, but the face was unmistakable. On the back, someone had scrawled in faded ink, "Elizabeth Blackwood, 1889. Who was she? What was her connection to this house? My mind was reeling. As I set the portrait down, I noticed something else partially hidden behind a trunk, an old leather-bound journal. My hands shook as I opened it, recognizing my grandmother's handwriting. The journal told a chilling tale. Elizabeth Blackwood had been the original owner of the house in the late 1800s. She had gone mad after the death of her infant son, locking herself away in the attic. Her husband eventually had her committed to an asylum, where she died. But according to my grandmother's writings, Elizabeth's spirit never left the house. My grandmother described witnessing all kinds of paranormal activity over the years. Objects moving on their own, disembodied voices, glimpses of Elizabeth's ghost. She'd been too afraid to ever tell anyone or try to sell the house. I slammed the journal shut, my mind spinning. This was insane. I needed to get out of there immediately. I stood up quickly, knocking over a stack of boxes. As they toppled, something fell out and skittered across the floor, a tarnished silver rattle. I bent to pick it up, and that's when I felt icy fingers brush the back of my neck. I spun around and found myself face to face with Elizabeth. Her eyes were pools of infinite darkness, her mouth opening impossibly wide in a silent scream. I scrambled backwards, tripping over boxes in my haste to get away. Elizabeth advanced on me, her form flickering like static. I could feel waves of anguish and rage emanating from her. My back hit the wall. I was trapped. In desperation, I held out the silver rattle. "I'm so sorry about your baby," I choked out. Elizabeth froze, her eyes fixed on the rattle. Slowly, she reached out a translucent hand. The moment her fingers touched it, she vanished in a blinding flash of light. I sat there trembling for what felt like hours, afraid to move. Finally, I managed to pull myself together enough to grab the journal and portrait and flee down the attic stairs. I didn't stop running until I was in my car, peeling out of the driveway. I haven't been back to the house since that day. I hired someone else to finish clearing it out and put it on the market. But sometimes late at night, I swear I can still hear the faint sound of a baby crying, followed by a woman softly singing a lullaby. The portrait of Elizabeth and my grandmother's journal are locked away in a safe deposit box now. I've thought about destroying them, but some part of me feels like I need to preserve the truth of what happened in that house. I know it sounds crazy, but I swear every word is true. I used to be a skeptic, but now I know with absolute certainty that there are things in this world that can't be explained. Whatever you do, be careful poking around in old houses. You never know what or who might still be lingering there, waiting to be found. I never believed in ghosts or anything supernatural, but what happened to me last summer changed everything. It all started when my wife and I decided to buy our first home together. We were so excited to find this charming old Victorian house at a surprisingly affordable price. It needed some work, but we saw so much potential. The day we moved in, I felt a strange uneasiness as soon as I stepped through the front door. I brushed it off as nerves about this big life change, but as we started unpacking, little things kept unsettling me. Objects would mysteriously move when I wasn't looking. I'd put a box down in one room, only to find it in a completely different place minutes later. My wife didn't seem to notice anything odd, so I kept quiet, not wanting to worry her. That first night, I had trouble sleeping. The house creaked and groaned, which I expected from an old building. But then I started hearing what sounded like footsteps coming from the empty attic above us. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was just the wind or the house settling, but it sounded so distinctly like someone walking back and forth. I got up to investigate, telling my wife I was just getting some water. As I climbed the narrow stairs to the attic, my heart was pounding. The footsteps had stopped, but now I heard what sounded like whispering. I couldn't make out any words, just a faint murmuring. My hand shook as I reached for the attic door handle, but when I opened it, the attic was completely empty and silent. No sign of anyone or anything that could have made those sounds. I did a thorough search, telling myself I was being ridiculous. It was just an empty, dusty old attic. I went back to bed, but barely slept a wink that night. The next day, things escalated quickly. I was home alone, my wife at work, when I heard a loud crash from upstairs. I ran up to find a heavy bookcase had somehow toppled over, spilling books and knickknacks everywhere. There was no way it could have fallen on its own. It was extremely sturdy and had been securely against the wall. As I was cleaning up the mess, I felt a sudden chill, like someone had opened a freezer right behind me. The hairs on my arms stood up. I slowly turned around, and I swear I saw a shadowy figure at the end of the hallway. It was only for a split second before it seemed to melt into the wall. I ran out of the house, my heart racing. I spent the rest of the day in a coffee shop, too scared to go back home. I didn't know how to tell my wife what was happening. I was afraid she'd think I was losing my mind. When she called to say she was on her way home, I reluctantly returned to the house. That evening I tried to act normal, but I was on edge. Every little noise made me jump. My wife noticed and asked what was wrong, but I brushed it off, saying I was just stressed about some work stuff. As we were getting ready for bed, the lights started flickering. At first it was subtle, easy to ignore, but then they began flashing rapidly, almost strobing. My wife looked at me with alarm. "What's going on?" she asked. Before I could answer, every light in the house went out at once, plunging us into total darkness. I fumbled for my phone to use as a flashlight. In the dim glow, I saw my wife's terrified face, and then, in the mirror behind her, I saw another face. It was pale, almost translucent, with hollow black eyes. I yelled and dropped my phone, shattering the screen. In the pitch black, we heard a low, guttural growl that seemed to come from everywhere at once. It didn't sound human or like any animal I'd ever heard. My wife screamed and grabbed my arm. We stumbled down the stairs, tripping and bumping into walls in our panic to get out. Just as we reached the front door, it slammed shut on its own. I pulled and yanked at the handle, but it wouldn't budge. The growling got louder, and now we could hear heavy footsteps coming down the stairs behind us. My wife was sobbing, begging me to get us out. In desperation, I grabbed a heavy vase and smashed it through the window next to the door. I helped my wife climb out, cutting my hands on the broken glass as I followed. We ran to the car and sped away, not even stopping to grab shoes or our phones. We spent that night in a motel, trying to process what had happened. In the light of day, it all seemed so surreal. Part of me wanted to believe it had all been some kind of shared hallucination or vivid nightmare. But the cuts on my hands were real, and so was the terror we'd both experienced. We never went back to that house. We left all our belongings behind, too afraid to step foot inside again. We filed a police report, but of course they found nothing unusual. We ended up staying with my parents while we figured out what to do next. I've spent countless hours researching the history of that house, trying to find some explanation for what we experienced. I discovered that it had a dark past. Multiple previous owners had moved out abruptly, and there were old rumors of tragic deaths on the property, but nothing concrete that could explain the terrifying phenomena we encountered. It's been months now, and we've settled into a new apartment. But I still have nightmares about that house. Sometimes I wake up in a cold sweat, certain I can hear that inhuman growl in the darkness. My wife and I rarely talk about what happened. It's like we both want to pretend it never occurred. But I know neither of us will ever forget that night of pure terror. I'm sharing this story now because I need to get it off my chest. For years, I scoffed at ghost stories and paranormal experiences. Now, I'm not so quick to disbelieve. There are things in this world that defy rational explanation, dark forces we can't comprehend. If you're house hunting and come across a suspiciously good deal on an old property with a murky history, my advice is to run the other way. Some houses hold secrets best left undisturbed. I still drive by that old Victorian sometimes, always in broad daylight. It sits there looking perfectly innocent, its windows dark and empty. But I know the truth of what lurks inside those walls, and I pray that no other unsuspecting family moves in, oblivious to the horrors that await them. Sometimes I wonder if we did the right thing by just running away. Should we have tried to help whatever trapped angry spirits might be in that house? Or would that have only put us in even greater danger? I don't have any answers. All I know is that I'll never step foot in that place again. If you're reading this and have experienced anything similar, know that you're not alone. There are things in this world beyond our understanding. Be careful out there and trust your instincts. If a place feels wrong, if you get that prickling sensation of being watched, don't ignore it. It might just save your life. I'm still trying to make sense of what happened to us in that house. Was it really ghosts, demons, some kind of interdimensional beings? Or is there a scientific explanation we just haven't discovered yet? I don't know if I'll ever have answers, but I do know that the world is stranger and more terrifying than I ever imagined before that summer night. For now, I'm focusing on moving forward and rebuilding our life, but a part of me will always be looking over my shoulder, wondering if we ever truly escaped whatever was in that house. And on dark, quiet nights, I still find myself listening for that unearthly growl, praying I never hear it again. As I pulled up to the address, I noticed all the lights were on in the two-story house. That was never a good sign. I approached the front door and knocked, announcing myself as Officer Johnson. A woman in her mid-30s answered, looking visibly shaken. Her name was Emily, and she explained that she had been hearing odd scratching and thumping sounds coming from upstairs for the past hour. "I'm home alone tonight and I'm terrified to go up there," she said, her voice trembling. "What if someone broke in?" I assured her I would do a thorough search of the house and told her to wait downstairs while I checked things out. As I climbed the stairs, I kept my hand near my holstered weapon, just in case. The upstairs hallway was dark and silent. I methodically checked each room, a bathroom, a small office, a guest bedroom, but found nothing out of the ordinary. The last room was the master bedroom at the end of the hall. As I entered, I immediately sensed something was off. The room looked normal at first glance, but there was a palpable tension in the air that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I scanned the room slowly, my eyes adjusting to the dim light coming from a bedside lamp. That's when I noticed it. A slight movement near the floor by the bed. I froze, my heart racing. Slowly, I crouched down and lifted the bedskirt. What I saw in that moment is something I'll never forget as long as I live. There was a man under the bed. He was curled up in the cramped space, his clothes filthy and torn. But it was his face that truly chilled me to the bone. His eyes were wide with terror, darting back and forth frantically. He was mumbling something under his breath that I couldn't make out. For a split second, we just stared at each other in shock. Then instinct kicked in, and I reached for my weapon, ordering him to come out with his hands up. But before I could even finish the sentence, he bolted. With surprising speed and agility, he scrambled out from under the bed and lunged for the bedroom window. I chased after him, but he had already pried the window open and was climbing out onto the roof. By the time I made it to the window, he had jumped down and was sprinting across the backyard, disappearing into the woods behind the house. I radioed for backup and we searched the area for hours, but there was no sign of the man. It was like he had vanished into thin air. When I returned to take Emily's statement, she was understandably distraught. She had no idea who the man could be or how long he might have been hiding in her house. As I drove home that night, I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling that had settled over me. Something about the whole situation felt wrong. The man under the bed hadn't acted like a typical burglar or home invader. He seemed genuinely terrified, almost as if he was hiding from something even worse than being caught by the police. The incident haunted me for weeks after. I kept replaying it in my mind, trying to make sense of it. Why was that man hiding there? What was he so afraid of? The more I thought about it, the more convinced I became that there was something deeper and more sinister going on that I couldn't explain. I started doing some digging in my free time, looking into any similar cases in the area. To my surprise, I found a few reports from neighboring towns of people finding strangers hiding in their homes, always described as looking disheveled and frightened. But none of the cases had any resolution. The intruders always managed to escape without a trace. About a month after the incident, I was working another night shift when I got a call that made my blood run cold. A man had been found hiding in a child's closet just a few blocks from Emily's house. By the time I arrived on the scene, he was already in custody. As they were putting him in the back of the squad car, I caught a glimpse of his face. It was him, the man from under the bed. I approached the car, my heart pounding. He looked even worse than before, gaunt, pale with dark circles under his eyes. When he saw me, A flash of recognition crossed his face. "Please," he whispered, his voice hoarse. "You don't understand. They're after me. They're after all of us." Before I could ask him what he meant, my colleague shut the car door and drove off to the station. I stood there in the street, a chill running down my spine despite the warm night air. In the days that followed, I tried to get more information about the man and what he had said, but it was like hitting a brick wall. He had apparently escaped custody during transport to the county jail, and no one seemed to know anything about his identity or whereabouts. I couldn't let it go. I started noticing strange things around town. Shadows moving in places they shouldn't. Whispered conversations that would stop abruptly when I walked by. More than once, I could have sworn I saw the man from under the bed watching me from a distance, only to disappear when I tried to approach. It's been 6 months now since that night at Emily's house, and I still don't have any answers. But I can't shake the feeling that I stumbled onto something that night, something big and terrifying that goes far beyond one scared man hiding under a bed. Sometimes at night, I find myself checking under my own bed, half expecting to find someone or something hiding there. I don't know what's really going on in this town, but I'm determined to find out. Because whatever it is, I have a sinking feeling that it's not just coming for that man anymore. It's coming for all of us, and I'm not sure how much longer we can hide. On our 3rd day there, we decided to take a walk down the beach to explore a bit. That's when we stumbled upon the old abandoned cottage, set back from the shore behind some scraggly dunes. It was this weathered wooden structure, paint peeling, shutters hanging crookedly. Something about it immediately caught our attention. "Whoa, check that place out," Jacob said, pointing. "Creepy," Madison remarked with a little shudder, but Asher's eyes were gleaming with excitement. "We should totally go check it out." I felt a mix of curiosity and unease. The rational part of my brain said we should just keep walking, but I couldn't deny the pull of mystery surrounding the dilapidated cottage. Before I knew it, we were picking our way through the dunes towards it. Up close, the cottage looked even more run down. Weeds choked the overgrown yard and vines crept up the sides of the structure. The porch steps groaned ominously under our feet as we approached the front door. To our surprise, it swung open with just a light push. "Hello," Jacob called out as we stepped inside. No answer, of course. The interior was musty and dim. Cobwebs clung to every surface, and a thick layer of dust coated the sparse furnishings. It was clear no one had lived here in years. We wandered from room to room, peering at the remnants of a life long abandoned, faded curtains, a few pieces of broken furniture, cracked dishes in the kitchen cupboards. "Guys, over here," Madison called from what looked like it had once been a bedroom. She was standing by an old wardrobe, its doors hanging open. Inside was a faded floral dress, looking like it belonged to another era entirely. As fascinating as the main floor was, it was the basement that really grabbed our attention. The narrow stairs leading down creaked with every step. The dank smell of mold and decay grew stronger as we descended. The basement was mostly empty, except for some rusty tools and broken bits of wood scattered about. But in one corner sat an old trunk. It was made of weathered leather, its brass fittings tarnished with age. With trembling fingers, I undid the clasps and lifted the lid. Inside was a treasure trove of memories, stacks of yellowed photographs and bundles of letters tied with faded ribbon. We gathered around, carefully lifting out the contents. The photos showed a family, mother, father, and 2 children, but there was something unsettling about their expressions. Even in poses that should have been happy, their eyes seemed haunted, their smiles forced. "Look at this," Asher said, unfolding one of the letters. We huddled close as he read aloud. "My dearest sister, I write to you in deepest distress. The occurrences in this house grow stranger by the day. Last night, I awoke to find every chair in the sitting room overturned, though I know I left them in perfect order before retiring. And the whispers, oh, the whispers. They come in the dark hours, unintelligible yet insistent. I fear for my sanity and for the safety of my family. If only Henry would agree to leave this accursed place." A chill ran down my spine as Asher's voice trailed off. We looked at each other with wide eyes, a mix of fear and fascination. "It's probably just some elaborate hoax," Jacob said with forced nonchalance. "You know, set up to scare tourists or something." But even as he spoke, a cold draft seemed to sweep through the basement, making the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. "Maybe we should go," Madison said quietly, and we all readily agreed. We carefully repacked the trunk, trying to leave everything as we'd found it. As we climbed the stairs, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. I glanced back over my shoulder, half expecting to see a ghostly figure lurking in the shadows, but there was nothing there, at least nothing I could see. That night, back at our rental house, we tried to laugh off our experience at the abandoned cottage. We joked about ghost stories and urban legends as we grilled burgers on the deck. But there was an undercurrent of unease that we couldn't quite shake. As I lay in bed that night, I found myself straining to hear any unusual sounds. Just as I was finally drifting off to sleep, I heard it, a faint melodic humming. It sounded like a lullaby, soft and sweet, yet somehow deeply unsettling. I sat up, heart pounding. "Do you guys hear that?" I whispered. In the darkness, I saw Madison sit up too. "I hear it," she said, her voice trembling slightly. We woke Jacob and Asher, and soon all 4 of us were huddled in the living room, listening intently. The humming seemed to be coming from outside, drifting on the night breeze. "It's coming from the direction of the cottage," Asher said. Part of me wanted to just lock the doors and hide under the covers until morning, but a stronger part felt inexplicably drawn towards the sound. Before I knew what was happening, we were outside, following the ethereal melody through the moonlit dunes. The abandoned cottage loomed before us, a dark silhouette against the starry sky. The humming grew louder as we approached, and now we could make out words, a mournful lullaby about lost children and a mother's grief. The front door stood open, as if inviting us in. The floorboards creaked beneath our feet as we made our way to the basement stairs. With each step down, the air grew colder, our breath visible in frosty puffs. In the basement, bathed in an otherworldly glow, stood the spectral figure of a woman. She wore the same floral dress we'd seen in the wardrobe upstairs. Her face was gaunt, eyes hollow with sorrow, but there was a spark of hope as she looked at us. "You've come," she said, her voice echoing strangely in the confined space. "I've waited so long for someone to hear me." We stood frozen, unable to speak, unable to run. "Please," the ghost continued, "you must help us. We're trapped here, my family and I, bound by grief and unfinished business." She gestured towards the trunk in the corner. "The photos, the letters, they tie us to this plane. You must destroy them, set us free." I found my voice at last. How do we know this isn't a trick? That you won't hurt us?" The ghost's expression softened. "I understand your fear, but I swear on the love I bear my children, I mean you no harm. We just want to rest." Something in her eyes, in the raw emotion of her voice, convinced me she was telling the truth. I looked at my friends and saw the same realization dawning on their faces. With shaking hands, we opened the trunk and began removing its contents. The ghost directed us to build a small fire in the rusty barrel that stood in one corner of the basement. One by one, we fed the photos and letters to the flames. As the last letter curled and blackened, a great sigh seemed to fill the room. The ghost woman smiled, a look of profound relief on her face. "Thank you," she whispered, her form already beginning to fade. "We can rest now. Be at peace." And then she was gone. The oppressive atmosphere that had filled the basement lifted, replaced by a sense of calm. We made our way back upstairs and out of the cottage. As we walked away, I glanced back one last time. In the pale light of dawn, the old building seemed somehow less foreboding, as if a great weight had been lifted from it. We never went back to the cottage after that night, but for the rest of our vacation and long after, we could feel the impact of what we'd experienced. It wasn't just about ghosts or the supernatural. It was about compassion, about the power of letting go, and the courage to face the unknown. That abandoned cottage on the beach changed us. It showed us that sometimes the scariest things aren't ghosts or monsters, but the regrets and sorrows we carry with us. And it taught us that even in the darkest moments, there's always hope for peace and resolution. I still think about that night often, about the family in the photographs, about the ghost woman's grateful smile as she faded away. I wonder about the story behind their tragedy, the circumstances that left them bound to that place for so long. But mostly, I'm grateful for the experience. As terrifying as it was in the moment, it opened my eyes to a world beyond what I thought I knew. Sometimes, on quiet nights, I swear I can still hear that lullaby on the wind. But now, instead of fear, it fills me with a sense of bittersweet peace. It reminds me that there are mysteries in this world that we may never fully understand. But that doesn't mean we shouldn't try to help where we can. Our beach vacation may not have been the carefree, relaxing trip we'd planned, but it gave us something far more valuable, a profound experience that none of us will ever forget. And whenever life gets tough, I think back to that night in the cottage, and I'm reminded of the strength we found in each other and the difference a small act of kindness can make, even to those who are no longer of this world.